Charlemagne's empire, at the height of its power, stretched across a vast portion of Europe. Its lands reached from the Ebro River in Spain across what is now France, Belgium, and the Netherlands to the North Sea, from the Atlantic coast in the west to the Oder River in the northeast, and down toward the Danube in the southeast. In the north, its boundary touched the Danish frontier, while in the south it extended deep into Italy. If one imagined a circle drawn from the city of Basel, the outer edges of this immense realm would nearly mark its limits. Yet authority across this enormous territory was not equally strong everywhere. The degree of imperial control depended largely on distance from the political centre and on the character of the populations who lived there. Along the eastern borders lay a wide zone inhabited mostly by Slavic and other non-Germanic peoples. These groups were kept in a state of partial submission through fear of imperial power and the presence of Frankish military forces nearby. They occasionally attacked frontier regions and were punished by military campaigns, but they were never fully integrated into the empire. They were neither Christian nor culturally Germanic, and their legal traditions were not treated as equal to those of the Franks. Their relationship to the empire resembled subjection rather than genuine membership. If these outer regions are excluded, the empire's true eastern boundary appears much closer to its core. It followed a line from lands north of the lower Elbe, down toward the middle Elbe and the Saale, then along the Danube Valley, toward the southeast, including the Bavarian frontier territories. From there, it turned southwest, encompassing regions such as Carinthia and Carniola, before reaching the Adriatic coast. This boundary held particular historical importance as it formed a lasting division between Germanic society and the Slavic world. Throughout the early medieval period, this frontier remained a zone of tension, gradually advancing eastward as German culture and Christianity slowly expanded into neighbouring lands. From the Adriatic coast, the imperial border followed the shoreline southward and then crossed the Italian peninsula, reaching the Mediterranean coast and continuing westward toward the region near Barcelona. From there, it extended north toward the Bay of Biscay, and then followed the Atlantic and North Sea coasts up to the Danish frontier. Within these borders, the political and cultural life of medieval Europe would unfold. The population of this vast realm was divided by a broad cultural line running roughly from the mouth of the Seine to Basel, and onward toward the Adriatic. On one side stood the Romanic peoples, shaped by the traditions of the Roman world. On the other stood the Germanic populations, who preserved their own languages, customs, and institutions. Compared with the earlier Roman frontier along the Rhine and Danube, this division revealed how far Germanic influence had advanced over the preceding centuries. Regions that had once belonged entirely to the Roman world now operated under political, social, and legal systems largely shaped by Germanic traditions. The history of the 4 centuries preceding Charlemagne tells the story of Germanic migrations, from the northern plains of Europe into territories once ruled by Rome. Over time, the Franks emerged as the dominant power among these groups. From their original homeland near the rivers Maas, Scheldt, Somme, and the Lower Rhine, they gradually expanded their authority. They subdued neighbouring Germanic tribes in the east, defeated the Alemanni in the Upper Rhine region, conquered the Visigoths in southern Gaul, brought the Burgundians under their rule, absorbed the Lombards in Italy, and extended their control over the Bavarians, Saxons, and Frisians. By the time Charlemagne came to power, most of these diverse peoples had been united under Frankish leadership. Through exceptional military ability and administrative skill, Charlemagne transformed these scattered territories into a single political structure. Despite ruling through conquest, he allowed many regions to preserve their local laws and administrative traditions. This balance between firmness and tolerance helped persuade conquered peoples that cooperation with Frankish rule served their interests. Rather than pursuing endless expansion, he focused on uniting the Germanic peoples of continental Europe into a Christian empire guided by Frankish leadership. The empire rested on three foundations: a shared Germanic identity, adherence to Christianity as recognized by Rome, and the political authority of the Frankish rulers. The formal beginning of this empire came in the year 800, when Charlemagne was crowned Emperor of the Romans by Pope Leo III in Rome. The meaning of this ceremony has long been debated. Some argued that the emperor's authority derived from the Pope's act of coronation, while others believed the ceremony merely gave religious recognition to power that already existed. The events of Charlemagne's reign suggest that his authority did not depend on papal approval. His position had already surpassed that of a traditional king through his conquests and leadership, and the imperial title simply expressed the reality of his power. Charlemagne himself clearly distinguished between his roles as king and emperor. Laws issued after the year 800 required all inhabitants of the realm to swear loyalty to him as emperor, even if they had previously pledged allegiance to him as king. These measures aimed to create a sense of unity across the empire's vast territories and to establish direct dependence on central authority. To administer this enormous realm, Charlemagne relied on a system of general laws known as capitularies. These were enforced through royal envoys who travelled throughout the empire to ensure that imperial commands were obeyed. Working in pairs, usually a bishop and a noble official, these representatives supervised local authorities and corrected abuses of power. Their instructions emphasized justice, protection of the weak, and adherence to Christian principles. The aim was not merely to control the population, but to promote order, fairness, and moral conduct across the empire. Although Charlemagne sought to strengthen central authority, he did not attempt to destroy local institutions. His objective was to ensure that local systems functioned according to law, Christian values. Written law was emphasized over oral tradition in order to create consistency and stability. Despite his efforts, however, he made little provision to guarantee the long-term survival of the system he had created. One of the greatest challenges facing any Frankish ruler was the question of succession. Following long-standing tradition, power was often divided among sons, a practice that had previously led to conflict and instability. Despite being aware of these dangers, Charlemagne chose to follow this tradition. In 806, he issued a decree dividing the empire among his three sons. Each was assigned a region to govern, and detailed provisions were made to regulate relations among them and to prevent conflict. The decree reflected the emperor's concern for stability and peace, yet it also revealed the limits of his political vision. The territories assigned to each son were not organized along clear ethnic or geographic lines, and the arrangement risked future disputes. Moreover, the decree made little reference to the imperial title itself, leaving uncertainty about whether the empire was to remain united or divided. Events eventually rendered this plan unnecessary. Two of Charlemagne's sons died before him, leaving only Louis to inherit the imperial authority. In 813, Charlemagne formally crowned Louis as emperor in a ceremony conducted without papal involvement, demonstrating that imperial legitimacy did not depend solely on Rome. When Charlemagne died in 814 after decades of rule, Louis became the sole ruler of the empire. He inherited immense power and a complex political system created largely through his father's personal strength. Yet the stability of these institutions depended on continued strong leadership, and Louis lacked the force of character that had defined Charlemagne's reign. Louis possessed administrative ability and genuine piety, but he struggled with consistency and decisiveness. His deep religious devotion often made him susceptible to the influence of advisors, both clerical and secular. In a political environment where strong personality was essential, his hesitation and lack of firmness weakened imperial authority. Early in his reign, he attempted to reform the imperial court, which he believed had grown morally corrupt. He ordered investigations into misconduct and removed individuals he considered unworthy. However, he also dismissed many of his father's trusted advisors, creating resentment among the aristocracy and fostering opposition to his rule. He faced the same problem of succession that had confronted his predecessors. With 3 sons of his own, he sought to divide responsibilities among them while preserving unity. His eldest son received authority in one region. Another was assigned a separate territory, and the youngest was prepared for future responsibility. This arrangement, intended to maintain stability, would eventually contribute to rivalry and conflict. The empire that Charlemagne had built stood at a turning point. Its future depended on whether the unity created through conquest and administration could survive under weaker leadership. The tensions that emerged during Louis's reign would soon reveal how fragile that unity truly was. Louis's early years as ruler were largely taken up with securing the empire's borders and strengthening connections across his vast realm. After 816, however, political and religious tensions began to intensify rapidly, especially concerning the relationship between imperial authority and the papacy. Louis had assumed power without formally consulting the Pope, raising an important question. How would the papacy respond to this precedent once a more assertive leader occupied the Roman See? At the same time, uncertainty surrounded the emperor's influence over papal elections. 2 powerful institutions now stood side by side, each seeking authority over the other. Pope Leo III, who had crowned Charlemagne and permitted Louis to assume the imperial title, died in 816 and was succeeded by Stephen IV. Although Stephen's election took place without imperial involvement, he immediately informed Louis and announced his intention to travel across the Alps to meet him. Louis prepared a grand reception at Reims, and within weeks the new pope arrived. Their brief meeting was dominated by intense negotiations, largely focused on preserving papal influence in Italy through cooperation with the Frankish ruler. The most significant moment of the visit was the ceremonial recrowning of Louis by the Pope. The ritual symbolically linked Louis to both the Christian legacy of Constantine and the royal tradition of Clovis, suggesting that imperial authority carried sacred legitimacy. While Louis had already ruled as emperor independently, this act provided later supporters of papal authority with grounds to argue that imperial power depended upon papal approval. Soon afterward, a major imperial assembly convened at Aachen. Its purpose was to reorganize and strengthen the empire, with particular emphasis on reforming monastic life, which was viewed as a foundation of social and moral order. Detailed regulations addressed the discipline of monasteries, their obligations toward the state, and the management of their extensive properties. Similar measures imposed stricter control over the secular clergy. These reforms reflected Louis's determination to reinforce religious institutions as pillars of political stability. At this same gathering in 817, Louis introduced a new arrangement for governing the empire after his death. Unlike Charlemagne's earlier plan, Louis emphasized preserving the unity of the empire as a sacred duty. After a period of fasting and prayer, he declared that divine guidance had designated his eldest son, Lothair, as co-emperor and future successor. Lothair would inherit supreme authority, while Louis's younger sons would rule subordinate kingdoms. Pippin received Aquitaine and surrounding territories, and Ludwig was granted Bavaria and neighbouring regions. Although these younger rulers would bear the title of king, their authority remained limited under the senior emperor. The arrangement imposed strict obligations on the younger brothers. They could administer local affairs independently, but were required to consult Lothair on major decisions. They were expected to visit his court annually, seek his approval before waging war or conducting diplomacy, and obtain consent for their marriages. If one of them died, his kingdom would remain intact rather than being divided among heirs, thereby preserving the overall unity of the empire. Through these provisions, Louis attempted to balance dynastic inheritance with centralized authority. Despite its intention to maintain unity, the settlement created deep resentment. Pippin and Ludwig felt disadvantaged by their limited territories and subordinate status, while Lothair became the representative of imperial centralization. This tension between unity and equal division shaped political conflicts for decades. Religious leaders generally supported the idea of a unified empire under Lothair, whereas emerging regional identities favoured greater independence. The stage was thus set for prolonged struggle between competing visions of political order. The arrangement also affected Italy, where Louis's nephew Bernard ruled. The new plan effectively reduced Bernard to a subordinate position, provoking him to rebel. His uprising attracted limited support, and Louis swiftly suppressed it by securing key Alpine routes. Bernard was captured, tried, and condemned to death, though the sentence was commuted to blinding. The punishment proved fatal, and Bernard died shortly afterward. Later accounts portrayed him as a tragic victim of harsh rule, but contemporary evidence suggests a calculated response to rebellion. During Louis's reign, the boundaries of his son's territories were repeatedly altered. Between 817 and 840, at least 6 major redistributions occurred, reflecting constant political manoeuvring. A significant turning point came with Louis's second marriage, and the birth of another son, Charles, later known as Charles the Bald. His mother, Judith, actively promoted her son's interests, and the emperor soon granted him substantial lands, carved from Lothair's territory. This decision intensified rivalry within the royal family and weakened the earlier principle of imperial unity. Lothair reacted with hostility and was temporarily confined to Italy, losing his central role in imperial governance. New proposals for dividing the empire emerged, some resembling earlier plans that treated the sons more equally. Yet these arrangements never fully materialized. Instead, shifting alliances and rebellions produced repeated cycles of conflict. At one point, Lothair and his brothers united against their father, forcing humiliating concessions from him. Soon afterward, however, Louis regained power and again promoted Charles's claims, redistributing territories to strengthen his youngest son's position. The death of Louis in 840 triggered open warfare among his heirs. Lothair claimed supreme authority as emperor, but his brothers Ludwig and Charles resisted. Their rivalry culminated in the Battle of Fontenay in 841, where the allied forces of Ludwig and Charles decisively defeated Lothair. This conflict was not merely a dynastic struggle, but also reflected deeper cultural divisions, as German-speaking and Romance-speaking regions increasingly asserted in distinct identities. The following year, Ludwig and Charles formalized their alliance at Strasbourg. In a remarkable demonstration of political awareness, each ruler addressed his troops in the language they understood, acknowledging the growing importance of linguistic and cultural differences. They swore mutual loyalty and pledged to oppose Lothair's claims. These oaths represent some of the earliest recorded examples of emerging Romance and Germanic languages, revealing how cultural divisions were shaping political realities. Continued negotiations eventually led to the Treaty of Verdun in 843, a decisive moment in European history. The empire was divided into 3 major regions: Lothair retained the imperial title along with a long central territory stretching from Italy through the Rhine Valley to the North Sea. Ludwig ruled the eastern lands, forming the basis of the future German kingdom. Charles governed the western regions, which would evolve into France. Although the imperial title survived, it held little practical authority, and real power rested with the regional rulers. Lothair's Middle Kingdom proved unstable. Its vast length, diverse population, and lack of shared identity made it difficult to govern effectively. After his death in 855, his territory was further divided among his sons, accelerating fragmentation. Subsequent partitions eventually eliminated the Middle Kingdom altogether, with its lands absorbed by eastern and western neighbours. These divisions contributed to long-term rivalries over border regions, conflicts that would shape European politics for centuries. By the mid-9th century, the once unified Frankish Empire had transformed into separate political entities that would gradually develop into modern European states. The imperial ideal persisted only as a symbolic memory, while regional identities and local power structures became the driving forces of political life. The divisions established during this period laid the foundations for the future map of Europe and marked the transition from a universal empire to a continent of competing kingdoms. From the late 9th century into the early 10th, Western Europe enters a stretch of history that feels like a map being redrawn in real time. It is not a clean story of one throne passing smoothly to the next. It is a story of exhaustion, sudden deaths, rival claims, and regions that start to behave as if they are countries in their own right. If the focus were only on royal family trees, this era could seem like a tangle of names and short reigns. But the deeper pattern is clearer. The large Frankish world created by earlier conquest begins to fracture into smaller political bodies, and the rules of legitimacy begin to shift under pressure. After the agreements that rearranged the old Carolingian lands, the leading rulers in East and West survive only a few more years. The emperor who had ruled in Italy dies without sons, and the imperial dignity becomes a prize that can be fought over rather than an inheritance that simply continues. One Western king secures the imperial title, helped by papal support, and a major conflict with the Eastern ruler seems likely. Yet it dissolves almost immediately when death removes the rival. What follows in the East is a familiar disaster. The territory is split again among sons, and although they attempt to cooperate, the arrangement is fragile. Each division has its own interests, its own dangers, and its own nobles, who expect to be heard. Italy becomes the first great testing ground. An Eastern prince moves south and appears ready to establish real authority there. But events turn against him. The Western contender withdraws and dies on the return journey, and the papacy reacts sharply to the rising influence from beyond the Alps. The Pope travels north, crowns a new Western king, and tries to shape the balance of power. Yet the new crowned ruler does not last long. He dies quickly, leaving behind children and the certainty of another partition. The wider Carolingian family, already weakened by decades of internal strain, begins to vanish at a startling pace. The problem is not only that heirs are young or unhealthy, it is that the dynasty's political quality is fading. Bodies fail, judgment fails, and authority becomes easier to challenge. One region is especially ready to break away. The valleys tied to the Rhône and the Saône had long been difficult to hold with a firm hand from distant royal courts. Local magnates, bishops, and monasteries had their own networks of loyalty and wealth. When central leadership stumbles again, a powerful nobleman seizes the moment. With the backing of regional aristocrats and strong support from church leaders, he has himself raised up as a king. This is not a normal succession. It is a public act of political creation. A new kingdom takes shape around rich bishoprics and strategic corridors, and the papacy lends recognition in ways that signal approval. The result is a precedent that cannot be undone by lectures about tradition. Once a kingdom can be made this way, others will consider doing the same. For a brief moment, however, the Carolingian world seems to pull itself together. Several of the remaining rulers agree that new breakaway kingships are a threat to everyone, and they coordinate action against such experiments. They even manage military pressure in contested zones and attempt to crush the most audacious usurper. Yet that cooperation collapses as soon as one member of the alliance gains a prestigious prize in Italy. The moment personal ambition is satisfied, the shared front breaks apart, and each ruler returns to defending his own immediate interests. At the same time, the Western Kingdom is battered by external attack. Scandinavian raiders strike repeatedly, and defending against them drains resources and morale. In the East, death removes one ruler after another until the surviving leadership is thin and unstable. In the West, a young king wins fame by defeating raiders and becomes the hope of his followers, only to die suddenly through misadventure. His brother lasts only a short time, showing little ability to stabilize anything before dying as well. Politics begins to resemble a stage on which the main actors keep disappearing mid-scene. By the mid-880s, only one legitimate Carolingian remains, with a claim broad enough to matter across the old empire. He ends up ruling a realm as large as Charlemagne's, at least on paper. But the size of the inheritance turns into a liability. What the moment requires is a leader capable of concentrating force and coordinating defense, especially against the continuing raids. Instead, the ruler is viewed as weak, hesitant, and physically unfit for the demands of war and government. Confidence collapses further when he chooses negotiation where his people expected defiance. A major northern assault is met with a deal that many see as humiliating. A heroic defense is rendered meaningless by political surrender, and the raiders are effectively encouraged to move onward into wealthier regions. That decision breaks something fundamental. It convinces many nobles and warriors that loyalty to the central ruler is no longer a duty when the ruler cannot protect the realm. When a challenger rises in the east, he is not a perfect candidate by blood, but he has what matters in a crisis: proven energy, military credibility, and powerful supporters in key frontier regions. He advances rapidly toward the heartlands, and instead of meeting stiff resistance, he is welcomed. The reigning emperor is abandoned and asks only for a quiet end. The challenger is acclaimed king by the eastern peoples. At first, it might look like the old empire could be reassembled under this new leadership. In reality, the moment for a single Frankish kingship has passed. Over the decades, landholding and local military obligation have created many smaller centres of power. Lords, bishops, and regional dynasts have built their own followings and expect to negotiate rather than obey. Once the central figure is removed, these local powers do not wait. They assert themselves. New kingdoms and rival kingship projects appear quickly, as if the collapse of one pillar has released pressure everywhere at once. Italy demonstrates the pattern with brutal clarity. Leading noble families compete for the crown. One claimant is elected and crowned in the traditional royal city, invoking older memories of kingship. Another arrives with armed support, forces recognition, then overturns the settlement through battle. Within a short span, Italy ends up with two kings at once, each too weak to master the nobility that supposedly serves him. One of them manages to compel papal cooperation and even receives the imperial title. But the honour does not create unity. It simply adds another layer of rivalry. In the Western Kingdom, a new kind of candidate rises. Not a direct heir, but a war leader whose reputation has been earned through defence. the count who saved a major city from siege becomes the obvious choice when the old emperor is cast aside. He is elevated as king with strong support in the north, while the south remains less certain. In Aquitaine, regional strength and local leadership continue to matter more than distant crowns, and a surviving child from the old royal line becomes a useful symbol around which later coalitions can form. The politics of the age is not simply about who is right by birth, but about who can attract allies, secure territory, and survive long enough to matter. Between Italy and the Western lands, the breakaway kingdom in the Rhone corridor continues under a young heir. Even there, legitimacy is complicated. The heir's position rests on recognition and local acceptance rather than on a universally respected rule of inheritance. North of that region, another Burgundian realm takes shape, centred on strategic routes and mountain passes. A leading magnate is raised to kingship, and his supporters imagine expansion into neighbouring borderlands. The old map is being replaced by a patchwork. Within months, the single empire that once provided a framework for European politics has effectively become a set of independent kingdoms. The method used to justify power also changes. For generations, rule had been treated as something inherited and divided like family property. Now, leaders are chosen because they seem capable, because they have armies, because they have allies among churchmen and nobles, and because circumstances demand action. A legitimate emperor is removed for incompetence. A legitimate child is overlooked. A ruler of imperfect birth is elevated because he appears strong enough to lead. Yet even as these new kingdoms assert independence, a lingering idea remains. Many of these rulers still want acknowledgement from the strongest king in the East, not because a title alone matters, but because a central authority can provide arbitration and support in emergencies. They are not looking for a master who governs every detail. They want a higher power that can legitimize, mediate, and occasionally intervene. That expectation shapes what the empire will become later. Not a fully unified state, but a political centre that claims precedence and offers a court of appeal. Out of this turbulent period, one long struggle becomes visible: election versus inheritance. When monarchies regain strength, they try to secure succession by blood, binding offices and crowns to family lines. When local powers dominate, they insist on the right to choose, using election as a weapon to limit the crown. This tension becomes one of the defining engines of medieval politics. It appears most sharply in moments of crisis, when no obvious heir can command obedience and the elites must decide whether to accept a dynasty or select a leader. Over time, the habit of choosing, once broad and unstable, becomes more organized and concentrated among a smaller circle of decision-makers, shaping how kingship and empire will function in the centuries ahead. During the Carolingian age, the Bishop of Rome was no longer just another senior churchman. Over time, Roman primacy grew into the strongest institution in Western Christianity, shaping politics and belief for centuries. This did not appear fully formed at the beginning of Christianity. It emerged gradually through pressure, opportunity, and careful argument. By around the early 3rd century, Rome's bishops had begun to sense their importance. Rome was the leading church of the Western Mediterranean, located in a city whose name still carried the weight of empire. Roman bishops increasingly spoke as if they held a special position among Christian leaders. Yet that claim was not universally accepted. In the Eastern Christian world, other great centres did not recognize Rome as a superior authority. Even in the West, respect for Rome often meant prestige and seniority, not the right to command. Rome's standing did not grow only from ambition. In turbulent times, the Roman Church often looked steady when other institutions collapsed. After imperial government shifted away from Rome, the city's bishop sometimes acted as an organizer, a mediator, and a source of public order. In a society shaken by conflict and uncertainty, practical leadership mattered. But practical leadership can be forgotten, challenged, or replaced. If Rome wanted lasting authority, it needed something stronger than reputation. That stronger foundation was built on a story of origins. The Roman Church emphasized the tradition that the Apostle Peter had led the Christian community in Rome and passed down a unique authority. The logic was simple and powerful. If Peter was the foremost apostle, entrusted with a special role, then the church that inherited Peter's legacy could claim a special position too. If Peter's authority could be traced forward through a line of successors, Rome could present itself not just as influential, but as the rightful centre of the Western Church. Over time, this Petrine claim spread widely in the Latin West. Several forces helped it. The Germanic invasions weakened older structures of local government that might have resisted Roman leadership. Many of the new rulers in Western Europe were initially outside the mainstream of Roman orthodoxy, and when they shifted toward orthodox belief, Rome could present itself as the safest guide. Gradually, the idea took hold that Rome was the place where doctrine and discipline were guarded most faithfully. By the end of the 6th century, the papacy appeared not only as a religious office, but as a coordinating power. Under Gregory the Great, Rome's bishop acted across borders, negotiated with hostile forces, directed missionaries, and managed church administration on a broad scale. This period shows a version of papal leadership that looks energetic and practical, yet not openly absolute. Other ancient Christian foundations could still be treated as honourable and significant. The papacy could appear as a guiding hand rather than a monarchy of the Church. After Gregory, however, survival became the dominant concern. The papacy's most urgent problem was the Lombards, who threatened Rome and surrounded much of central Italy. In theory, the natural defender of Rome was the Roman Empire in the east, whose government was based in Constantinople. Italian administration operated through officials, and one of the most important posts was located at Ravenna. Yet distant rule often meant heavy taxation without reliable defence. Italians experienced imperial demands, but not imperial protection. Rome's bishops found themselves squeezed between local danger and distant indifference. Under this pressure, the papacy looked for a new protector. It found one in the Franks. Among the major Germanic powers of the West, the Franks stood out for one key reason. Their rulers were tied to Orthodox Roman Christianity rather than rival interpretations. This did not necessarily mean the Frankish elite was morally transformed. Early Frankish society could be brutal, and the story of their politics includes violence, betrayal, and ruthless competition. Yet the Church remained the one institution capable of carrying learning, administration, and moral language across generations. As Frankish power grew, the Church within Frankland also became stronger, and with strength came the possibility of a partnership with Rome. Over time, the Frankish Church began to take on a more organised form, and one figure is central in that process: Boniface. His work in reforming and structuring church life connected the Frankish hierarchy more closely to Rome's influence. It was not simply local improvement. It strengthened a sense that Rome was the reference point for order, discipline, and legitimacy. This mattered when political and military needs aligned. The papacy needed a champion against Lombard pressure. The Frankish leadership needed religious legitimacy. In the mid-8th century, a powerful Frankish ruler sought to replace a weakened royal line. The Pope's approval helped sanctify that transition, and in return Frankish arms defended Roman interests in Italy. The alliance became official, and its consequences were enormous. Under Charlemagne, this relationship reached its most impressive form. His reign looked like a long campaign on behalf of an organized Christian society. War and conquest were repeatedly framed as acts of religious and political expansion at the same time. Meanwhile, assemblies that had once been irregular and improvised became major gatherings where decisions on both church and state were made and recorded. The result was a new kind of government, energetic, structured, and deeply involved in religious affairs. Charlemagne spoke with reverence toward the apostolic seat in Rome, and his public language often sounded humble before St. Peter's authority. Yet, his actions show something more complex than submission. He behaved like a ruler who believed he had responsibility for the church within his realm. After becoming emperor, he extended that sense of responsibility to the whole empire. In his view, Rome was within imperial territory, and the Bishop of Rome, like other bishops, required a temporal protector. The emperor's role was not merely to defend, but also to supervise, at least to some extent. This created a fundamental question. If a new Western Empire existed, what did it mean for the papacy? Charlemagne had taken protection seriously, especially compared to the Eastern emperors, who were often absent or entangled in their own disputes. But protection carried an implied claim. If the emperor guarded Rome, could he also regulate Rome? Two competing theories hardened over time. One view argued that the empire owed its status to papal coronation, and therefore should obey papal direction. In its sharpest form, this argument extended beyond the emperor to all secular rulers, claiming that spiritual authority could direct temporal power because it was higher in nature. The opposing view argued that the emperor inherited the rights of earlier Roman rulers, and therefore could exercise oversight over Rome's bishop just as earlier emperors had done. These positions could not fully coexist. If either side pushed its theory to the limit, the other would be reduced to a dependent. To understand why the conflict kept returning, it helps to recognize that the papacy was not a single, simple office. It combined multiple roles that did not always fit together. First, the Pope was the Bishop of Rome. In that capacity, election and accountability were local matters. The clergy and people of Rome had traditional claims in choosing their bishop, just as in other cities. Second, the Pope became the sovereign of a territorial state. Lands donated to the Roman Church grew steadily, and eventually formed a more concentrated bloc around Rome. By the Carolingian period, it made sense to speak of a papal territory governed as a state. Frankish rulers confirmed these possessions and added to them. Once the Pope was a political ruler, local elites cared intensely about who would hold the office. A pope was no longer only a teacher of faith. He was also a lord of land, revenue, offices, courts, and armies. Third, the Pope stood as the leading authority of the Western Church. In practice, this leadership had been accepted for centuries, but the meaning of it could vary. At its highest pitch, it turned into a claim that Rome held the purest apostolic inheritance, and therefore could judge disputes everywhere. This idea gained strength during centuries when Western Europe lacked other reliable centres of learning and guidance. People accepted Rome's leadership because there were few alternatives. The problem was that these three functions constantly collided. A pope who worked well as a spiritual leader might be poorly suited to govern a complicated state. A capable political manager might be a weak moral guide. A pope determined to press universal authority might neglect local Roman interests and provoke hostility at home. These tensions shaped many of the sharpest crises in medieval church history. No issue revealed the conflict more clearly than papal elections. If the Pope was only the Bishop of Rome, local election made sense. But if the Pope ruled a territory, the nobility and officials of that territory wanted influence. And if the Pope was head of the Western Church, many outside Rome felt they had a stake in the choice. As the papacy's reach expanded, the fight over who controlled elections became one of the most persistent sources of instability. During Charlemagne's lifetime, these tensions were muted by his personal authority. He was too powerful, and his service to church and order was too great for open confrontation to succeed. After his death, the situation grew more complicated. Under Louis the Pious, imperial oversight continued in practice, especially regarding Roman politics and papal elections. When a pope died, Rome did not always wait for formal imperial involvement before choosing a successor. Yet newly elected popes often felt the need to send messages north, explaining that the election had followed proper procedures and asking for confirmation of privileges. This reveals an atmosphere where Rome's leaders understood that an emperor might claim a right to judge whether an election was valid, even if he was not directly present at it. Louis's eldest son, Lothair, became a key figure in enforcing imperial authority in Rome. When he travelled there as an imperial representative, the papacy sometimes pressed him to accept coronation and anointing, strengthening the idea that imperial status required papal sanction. But imperial visits could also show the opposite. A ruler arriving to investigate Roman disorder, regulate officials, and assert oversight of law and government. A major example of this imperial push came with an important legal settlement issued under Lothair. Its purpose was to restore order in Rome and clarify the relationship between papal rule and imperial supervision. One of its most striking features dealt with law itself. The decree called upon inhabitants to state under which legal tradition they wished to live. This seems strange in modern eyes, but it matched the Germanic idea that law was personal rather than territorial. Under that view, a person carried his legal identity as a mark of birth and peoplehood, and governments were expected to judge him according to that inherited law. Roman tradition had taken the opposite approach. One empire, one law, binding citizens across a shared territory. Rome had long preserved the older Roman legal spirit, more strongly than many regions conquered by Germanic powers. The new imperial policy signalled that Rome's government would now recognise the mixed population of the region and the realities of a society shaped by conquest and settlement. It was also a reminder that imperial authority could reach into Rome's most ancient assumptions. At the same time, the settlement affirmed the Pope as the lawful executive ruler in his territory, while reserving for the emperor the highest supervisory role. The emperor stood as the supreme guardian of order and the final court of appeal. Jointly appointed agents were expected to report regularly on administration. Complaints were to be addressed first within papal structures, but imperial intervention was available if abuses continued. Even if later writers differed on precise details, the broader pattern is clear. Rome was not treated as fully independent. The empire still asserted a right to oversee. As the Carolingian world fell into dynastic conflict, the papacy became entangled in struggles that were not purely religious. The reign of Gregory IV offers a vivid example. In the fierce disputes between Louis the Pious and his sons, Rome's bishop did not appear as a commanding judge who could impose peace by spiritual force. Instead, he was drawn into the conflict as a useful symbol, especially for factions that benefited from papal presence. When Lothair moved against his father, the Pope travelled north in an attempt to mediate and prevent bloodshed. Yet mediation failed. The crisis ended not through moral authority, but through political manoeuvring and desertion. On the night before battle, Louis's supporters slipped away in large numbers, leaving him powerless. The place gained a reputation for betrayal, and the Pope returned to Rome with little to show for the journey. Frankish church leaders criticised his actions, and the episode demonstrated a reality that would repeat many times. Papal prestige could be enormous, but turning prestige into effective control over kings was far more difficult. Across this entire era, one trend stands out. The claims of Rome kept expanding, often without a clear, consistent principle guiding every decision. The papacy's authority was growing, but it grew inside a world of shifting alliances, rival dynasties, and competing legal traditions. Sometimes Rome appeared as a stabilizing centre. Sometimes it looked like a player caught in the current of Frankish politics. What remained constant was the direction of movement. The papacy was collecting arguments, precedents, and expectations. When conditions became favourable, those accumulated claims would be pressed more boldly, and the medieval struggle between spiritual supremacy and imperial sovereignty would enter its most dramatic phase. By the middle of the 9th century, the papacy was still operating in a world where emperors and kings could try to supervise Roman affairs. But the city of Rome was also learning how to push back. That tension shows up immediately in what happens after the death of a pope in the 840s. A new pontiff is chosen quickly, and the election is carried through without waiting for the imperial court's approval. On paper, this kind of speed and independence could be treated as a violation of the rules that had been laid down earlier, and it was not something the emperor's family intended to ignore. The response comes from Italy. An imperial prince, acting with his father's authority, moves toward Rome with armed support and demands to know why the normal procedures were bypassed. The Pope receives him politely and stages the kind of ceremonial welcome Rome does best. But the welcome comes with a condition. Before entering the most symbolic church in the city, the prince must promise that he has no intention of harming the rights of the Roman Church. Once that guarantee is given, the imperial party proceeds to do what really matters. The election itself is examined, questioned, and reviewed, and the imperial representatives declare themselves satisfied. The message is clear. Even if Rome tries to move quickly, imperial oversight can still be asserted. Yet the limits of that oversight appear just as clearly. The prince tries to go further and secure a personal oath of loyalty from the Pope and the Romans, not to the emperor in general, but to him as ruler in Italy. That request is rejected. The Pope insists that loyalty is owed to the emperor alone, not to an Italian kingship as a separate political authority. What follows is a compromise in ceremony, rather than a surrender in principle. The prince receives a royal coronation connected with Italy and the Lombard tradition. But Rome refuses to be treated as a normal piece of the Italian state. It is an early version of a theme that returns again and again in European history. Rome may accept protectors, but it resists being absorbed. Then comes a shock that exposes how vulnerable the Holy City can be. In the mid-840s, raiders from the sea strike Roman territory with terrifying effect. The attack is not only a military disaster, it is a psychological one. It demonstrates to the Christian world that sacred places can be plundered, and it reveals how weak local defences have become. Effective resistance does not come immediately from emperors or kings. Instead, the most serious long-term response begins along the coast, where maritime cities, increasingly wealthy and increasingly confident, cooperate to fight back. Their fleets defeat the raiders near the mouth of the Tiber, and that victory creates the breathing space needed for new fortifications. A new defensive zone is built to protect the great church district near St. Peter's, and the fortified quarter takes on a name that preserves the memory of the Pope associated with that construction. But politics inside Rome does not become calmer. If anything, the crisis accelerates internal division. Many Roman nobles are happy to use imperial failures as an argument for greater independence. At the same time, Another group forms that still sees value in imperial connection, either for protection or for leverage against local rivals. Between these factions stands the papacy itself, trying to preserve its own interests and survival. In practice, the papacy often becomes the object of struggle rather than the master of events, pulled and pushed by Roman families on one side and imperial agents on the other. That conflict bursts into the open in a contested election. After the death of a pope, one faction chooses a candidate and informs the emperors, presenting the announcement as part of long-standing custom. But the opposing side moves faster and plays a harder game. It promotes its own candidate, wins over key messengers, and brings its man into Rome with outside force. Control of the major churches becomes a political prize. Two rivals appear at once, each claiming to be the rightful bishop of Rome, each waiting for the street politics and alliances of the city to decide the outcome. What breaks the deadlock is not theology. It is the unexpected firmness of Roman public opinion. When the population refuses to accept the imperial choice, the imperial officers retreat, and the Roman candidate is installed. The attempt to impose a pope fails, yet the episode shows how fragile papal independence can be when armed power enters the city. A few years later, a new pope takes office whose reign becomes a turning point. This pontiff does not treat the papacy as merely a prestigious bishopric inside a larger imperial system. He thinks of the Roman See as a divine court with authority over the whole Christian world, able to judge disputes, correct abuses, and summon rulers and bishops alike to account. Under him, the papacy's claims appear in multiple arenas at once: relations with the Greek-speaking East, authority over regional churches in the West, and intervention in moral crises involving kings. The Eastern question is the hardest and the most explosive. In the Byzantine understanding, Rome is still part of a single Roman imperial order centered on Constantinople. The idea that there could be two Roman empires feels absurd to many Eastern officials, and the idea that a Western ruler can carry the imperial title is tolerated only when the Eastern state is too weak to prevent it. That old assumption has a direct consequence. If there is one empire, then Rome's church leadership should ultimately stand under imperial authority from the East. Meanwhile, the papacy in the West has grown stronger not because of abstract arguments, but because it has provided leadership, organization, and legitimacy in a region where imperial power often feels distant or unreliable. Now, a pope appears who is ready to claim that the relationship has reversed. In his view, Rome is not a dependent church. It is the head of Christendom, and it has the right to speak on Eastern affairs as well as Western ones. The immediate trigger is a struggle for control of the leading church office in Constantinople. An elderly patriarch known for strict morals is pushed out through a palace revolution after refusing to tolerate the openly scandalous behaviour of a powerful figure close to the throne. In his place, a layman of enormous intellect and reputation is elevated rapidly through clerical ranks, ignoring the normal steps that church rules required. The deposed patriarch appeals to Rome. For a pope determined to assert universal authority, this is the perfect opening. Roman representatives are received in Constantinople, sometimes respectfully, sometimes with hostility, yet always with caution. Eastern leaders understand that Rome can influence opinion in the West, and that influence is dangerous. The conflict becomes so sensitive that when a particularly sharp statement is sent from Rome, extraordinary measures are taken to keep it from reaching the capital. Beneath the surface dispute lies something larger than one office. It is a test of whether Rome can claim jurisdiction beyond the Western world. At the same time, other long-running divisions push the churches further apart. One dispute concerns religious images in worship. Early Christian suspicion toward images had gradually softened, and many churches became richly decorated. Later, a fierce backlash emerged in the East, turning into campaigns to destroy images as a form of idolatry. In parts of the East, the controversy becomes entangled with court politics, with emperors at times encouraging repression and at other times restraining it. In the West, the Roman Church tends toward a practical position, allowing images as aids to devotion. The difference is not a minor detail, it becomes one more marker separating Eastern and Western religious culture. Another fault line is territorial and missionary competition. Along the lower Danube and in the Balkan world, a newly Christianizing kingdom becomes a battlefield of influence. Missionaries from Constantinople have already made progress there, and the local ruler has been baptized and tries to pull his people into the new faith. Then, Western agents arrive and argue that the teaching received from the East is incorrect. The ruler, anxious about salvation and legitimacy, turns to Rome for guidance. Rome responds with a massive set of instructions, treating the inquiry not as a polite consultation, but as evidence that Rome's authority should extend into that region. The eastern side answers with its own claims. The region lies within the orbit of the Eastern Empire, and church connections, it argues, must match political reality. Doctrinal and disciplinary disputes are thrown into the argument, each side presenting the other as dangerous and misguided. In practice, geography, power, and cultural difference make a Western victory unlikely. The struggle hardens resentment and helps push the two churches toward a deeper separation. While these Eastern quarrels develop, the same Pope is also reshaping the West. One of the most famous confrontations involves a king who wants to end a politically arranged marriage and replace his wife with a long-time partner. The king and his circle attempt to make the divorce look lawful by using the legal habits of the age. Public accusations, staged confessions, and the ritual tests that people believe reveal divine judgment. A churchman serves as champion in a dangerous ordeal, and when the result supports the queen's innocence, the king refuses to accept the outcome and keeps her under control anyway. Later, a new hearing is arranged, and the queen is pressured into a confession that supports the king's plan. Councils are convened with friendly bishops, neighbouring rulers are managed through concessions, and publicity is used as a weapon. On the surface, the system appears to function. The king seems to have the clergy behind him, and the road to a new marriage looks open. Yet not everyone cooperates. A leading archbishop outside the king's control refuses to attend the staged proceedings and produces a devastating legal critique that exposes the abuses and procedural fraud. Even with that criticism circulating, the king continues, secures clerical approval from his own supporters, and celebrates new marriage. At this point, Rome intervenes decisively. The Pope frames the case as a moral emergency and a question of justice for a wronged woman. Legates are dispatched to investigate, and a council is called to judge the issue. The king manipulates attendance and floods the meeting with loyal bishops. The queen is absent, and her absence is interpreted as guilt. Worse, the Pope's own representatives are bought off. The council endorses the king's plan and sends high-ranking churchmen to Rome, expecting confirmation. Instead, Rome turns the tables. The Pope receives the envoys coldly, delays them, then denounces them publicly and strips them of office. The king's allies rage and attempt to mobilize imperial pressure against the Pope, but the effort collapses amid illness and political calculation. Inside the Frankish world, fear spreads. Excommunication and deposition are no longer abstract threats. They have been used, and they have worked. A papal agent is sent north with sweeping authority, negotiating alliances with other kings and closing in on the central target. Facing the prospect of isolation and hostile coalitions, the king yields outwardly. The legitimate queen is restored, the rival partner is expelled, and the Pope's authority appears to triumph. But the story does not end cleanly. The king continues his relationship with the excommunicated woman and pressures the queen into new petitions designed to reopen the case. After the Pope's death, his successor tries to keep the same line. An uneasy meeting is arranged in Italy, where the king seeks relief from penalties and a new settlement. To prove innocence, the king demands a ritual purification through the most solemn act available in that religious culture. He swears that no forbidden relationship has continued and receives the sacrament as a public sign. Many attendants swear similarly. The immediate result is political. The threat of punishment is postponed, and the king leaves believing the danger has passed. Then reality intervenes. On the return journey, a deadly fever strikes the party, and the king dies on the road. Contemporaries naturally connect the timing to divine judgment, and the story becomes fuel for the belief that Rome's will cannot be defied without consequence. A modern view can point to environment and disease rather than miracle. But the political effect is the same. The papacy's moral authority grows, and fear of spiritual penalties becomes a factor rulers must calculate. A third conflict shows the same pope pushing against regional church power. A bishop in northern Gaul quarrels with his metropolitan over discipline and procedure. The bishop appeals to Rome. The metropolitan tries to stop the appeal by arresting him and keeping him under control. The Pope responds by ordering that the bishop be restored or allowed to come to Rome for judgment. The king, needing papal support for his own plans, forces compliance. The bishop reaches Rome, and after delays designed to display authority, the Pope declares him innocent and threatens direct restoration if the metropolitan does nothing. When resistance continues, Rome restores the bishop anyway, sending him back under the protection of a papal agent. The message is unmistakable. Rome claims the right to act not only at the top of the hierarchy, but deep inside local church structures, even against powerful archbishops. This matters far beyond one quarrel. It shows how papal power can weaken national church leadership and, by extension, unsettle royal influence as well. If Rome can intervene in any dispute and define it as religious, then almost any political conflict can be pulled into its orbit. Compared with the era of Charlemagne, the distance travelled is enormous. What once looked like cooperation under a strong emperor now looks like a papacy learning to command through legal claims and spiritual penalties. That shift also pushes the papacy toward a different need, a more formal legal foundation. Earlier generations relied on broad arguments about tradition and spiritual authority. As conflicts multiplied, it became useful to have documents, collections, and written precedents that could be cited as law. Over time, church legal collections gather canons from councils and texts attributed to the apostles, alongside official letters issued by bishops of Rome. These compilations elevate papal letters into the same category as conciliar decrees, turning papal decisions into standard sources of law for the Church. But even those collections have limits for a papacy that wants to claim timeless authority. If papal legal power seems to begin only when Christianity gains official recognition in the Roman state that can appear to tie Rome's authority to political circumstances rather than to divine origin. A papacy that sees itself as founded directly by Christ naturally wants its legal record to reach back to the very beginning. The problem is that early documents of the kind later ages desire are not available in the needed form. In an environment where the institutional goal is considered sacred and urgent, the temptation arises to fill the gaps, creating texts that look ancient, speak with confident authority, and provide exactly the legal foundation later claims require. The result is a new phase in papal history, where power is justified not only by influence and fear, but by an expanding architecture of written law that appears to anchor Rome's authority in the earliest age of the Church. In the middle of the 9th century, a set of documents began circulating that would reshape the balance of power inside Western Christianity. They claimed to preserve ancient rulings from Rome, reaching back beyond the age of Constantine and even into the era of the earliest Christian leaders. If those texts had been authentic, they would have offered Rome an unbreakable legal foundation for sweeping authority. They were not authentic. Yet for centuries, they were treated as if they were. The first clear signs of this collection appear during a tense conflict involving Pope Nicholas I and a powerful church leader in the Frankish world, Hincmar, as they argued over the treatment of a bishop named Rothad of Soissons. In the middle of that dispute, references emerged to an impressive archive of early papal decisions. Exactly where the collection was produced has been debated, but a strong line of modern scholarship places its creation in the Frankish lands. The likely authors were not acting randomly. The texts strongly favoured a particular agenda, strengthening individual bishops against secular interference, tightening the bond between local bishops and Rome, and limiting the power of regional church superiors who had long acted as the gatekeepers of discipline and appeals. By the standards of later centuries, the collection was a large-scale fraud. That conclusion is no longer controversial. Even within Catholic scholarship, the documents are recognised as fabrications. The real argument has never been only about whether they were false, but about why they were written and how their creators justified the act. Medieval culture did not treat forgery the way modern scholarship does. When religion was involved, many writers believed that serving a sacred cause could excuse methods that would otherwise be condemned. In that mindset, questioning the authenticity of pious-looking documents could feel less like careful investigation and more like a kind of irreverence. The collection was published under a respected name, one that suggested connection to a famous church compiler. That branding gave it instant credibility. It also allowed the new documents to blend into existing legal tradition without raising obvious alarm. Inside the collection were large numbers of supposed papal letters from the earliest centuries and invented decisions of councils that had never occurred. The tone was consistent. The clergy, and especially bishops, were portrayed as a protected order with rights that could not be overridden lightly by kings, local nobles, or even regional church authorities. In its most generous interpretation, the project can be described as an attempt to elevate the moral standing of church leadership and give bishops greater power to restrain violence and disorder in Europe. A world filled with feuds, raids, and political instability could easily be imagined as needing a stronger spiritual police. The authors may have believed that reinforcing the dignity and immunity of bishops would strengthen the Church's ability to discipline society. But the collection did more than protect bishops. It quietly shifted the centre of gravity toward Rome by presenting the Pope as the ultimate source of episcopal authority and the final court of appeal in nearly every serious dispute. That second feature is what made the forged texts so historically decisive. Most people in the 9th century did not spend their lives debating legal theory. But legal theory mattered whenever conflicts erupted between Rome and local powers. In struggles over depositions, elections, appeals, and discipline, the papacy could now point to a library of venerable texts that appeared ancient, authoritative, and unquestionable. Those texts consistently favoured Rome's right to intervene, to judge, and to reverse decisions made elsewhere. From a modern perspective, it is tempting to ask why opponents did not simply expose the fraud immediately. The answer lies in the intellectual climate. The habit of close textual criticism was weak. The instinct to doubt was even weaker. Many people assumed that the older and more mysterious a claim sounded, the more likely it was to be true. There was also a deep reluctance to challenge religious authority by questioning documents that claimed to speak in the voice of early saints and bishops. In that atmosphere, the person demanding proof could appear more suspicious than the person providing grand-sounding proof. As a result, the forged decretals were accepted, copied, cited, and used as legal ammunition for generations. They remained influential until the 15th century, when European learning began to change. Scholars started to compare language, style, and historical context more carefully. When that light finally fell on the collection, its flaws became hard to ignore. The documents were not only fabricated, they were often careless, anachronistic, inconsistent in ways that became obvious once people began asking the right questions. Yet by the time serious doubt took hold, the damage or the achievement, depending on one's perspective, had already been done. For hundreds of years, these texts helped Rome present its authority as ancient law rather than recent ambition. They helped shift the legal foundations of church government. Earlier, Christian authority could be grounded in multiple sources: the teachings of Jesus in the Gospels, apostolic writings, the decisions of major councils accepted across Christendom, and the interpretations of respected early theologians. Another category also existed: responses given by older churches to newer communities, including letters attributed to bishops of major apostolic centres. Among these, Rome's letters held special prestige, but they were still one type of authority among several. The forged collection changed the proportions. It encouraged the idea that papal letters carried weight equal to the highest sources of Christian teaching and law, and in practice they soon threatened to outweigh them. Once a system treats papal decisions as the most reliable legal tool in difficult cases, the rest of church authority gradually becomes secondary. This marked the rise of a new model for church governance, one built around written papal rulings and appeals to Rome. In this model, law does not primarily flow from broad councils representing the whole church. It flows from the Pope's decisions, which are treated as the decisive interpretive voice. This was not the only possible direction. A council-centered church could have imagined the Pope as the chief administrator of rules, shaped by the wider agreement of Christian communities and their leaders. Such a structure would have made the church more representative, with councils acting as the main legislative and judicial authority. Another alternative, argued by reform-minded voices at many points in history, was to base authority almost entirely on the text of the New Testament. That approach left little room for later institutional claims, not firmly anchored in early documents. But in the 9th century, the council-centered model clashed with Rome's claims, and the strictly scripture-centered model offered no support for the sweeping theory of papal supremacy that had already been forming for centuries. The forged decretals strengthened the papal model at the very moment when political circumstances allowed it to expand. By the time Pope Nicholas I died in 867, the medieval concept of papal supremacy had largely settled into a recognizable shape. Later, popes would not invent the idea from scratch. They would apply it. The immediate successors of Nicholas were capable leaders, and Europe lacked any single power strong enough to force Rome back into a narrower role. Popes continued to be elected in Rome without formal consultation of the emperor, and the omission was often handled through polite apology and ritual reassurance. The pattern suggests that Rome was pushing outward, while still avoiding open confrontation when it seemed risky. A striking glimpse into this evolving relationship appears in a letter associated with the Emperor Louis II, written in response to sharp criticism from the Eastern Emperor in Constantinople. The Eastern ruler argued that the imperial title belonged only to the line that inherited it directly from the ancient Roman state. The Western Emperor's response did not rest primarily on armies, lineage, or Senate tradition. Instead, it leaned heavily on sacred legitimacy. The letter framed imperial dignity as something granted through papal consecration. It argued that kings who had received anointing and coronation in Rome held a higher status than those who had not, and it portrayed the Western Empire as the true protector of the Holy City and its spiritual leader. Whatever the letter's exact authorship, its meaning is clear. It represents a major shift in how imperial authority could be explained. The emperor's title is presented as dependent on papal action. The crown becomes, in theory, a gift conferred through religious sanction. That concept weakened the old claim that emperors inherited ancient rights to supervise the church. It also gave the papacy a powerful argument. If the pope could make an emperor, the pope could also judge emperors. This change was soon tested in practice. After Louis II died in 875 without a direct heir, the imperial throne did not pass smoothly as it had in earlier Carolingian practice. For the first time in a clear way, rival Western powers competed for the imperial crown. A French king, Charles the Bald, wanted the title even though his record as a ruler was unimpressive. Across the Rhine, German rulers and princes possessed stronger political foundations and could claim equal right to the honour. The vacancy created leverage for Rome because the crown could now be treated as something that required papal approval to become fully legitimate. Pope John VIII moved quickly, favouring the French candidate and calling Charles to Rome for coronation. Charles responded as expected. He raised money, crossed the Alps, and accepted the crown with speed. In doing so, he reinforced the idea that imperial dignity was granted through the Pope. This appeared, at first glance, to be a triumph for papal supremacy. But the victory carried a hidden cost. A distant emperor who was obedient in theory might be useless in practice. Italy faced external threats, including raids and pressure from forces beyond its borders, and Rome still needed protection. A crown that produced prestige without security could leave the papacy exposed. Even worse, by choosing sides, the papacy intensified rivalry between major powers and invited their competition into Roman politics. John VIII proved energetic and resourceful. He worked to organize Italian resistance, sought unity among quarreling regions, and even took an active role in military measures. This shows a papacy willing to act not only as a spiritual authority, but also as an Italian power among other Italian powers. Yet that transformation was dangerous. The moment the papacy behaved like one competitor in the peninsula's political game, it risked losing the aura of being above politics. Once the papal office became a prize in factional struggles, reverence could turn into bargaining and coercion. The weakness of the imperial protector became obvious when Charles the Bald was summoned again to defend Rome and briefly appeared as a champion, only to retreat as soon as German opposition threatened him. He abandoned the situation and died soon after on the journey back across the Alps. His death reopened the question the papacy had tried to control. Should the empire fall to a strong ruler who might resist Rome, or to a weaker candidate who might obey but fail to protect? German influence grew in northern Italy, gathering supporters and building networks inside Rome itself. John VIII, facing pressure and intrigue, sought breathing space abroad and turned to diplomacy in multiple directions. Yet no solution produced lasting stability. Eventually, German rulers agreed to push forward a new imperial candidate, Karl the Fat. The appearance of papal freedom of choice remained, but the reality was different. Rome crowned the man it could not successfully refuse. The outcome was bitterly familiar. The new emperor gained the title and then withdrew, offering little support against Italy's dangers. The papacy was left to navigate threats and internal opposition largely alone. When John VIII died, the bright revival that had begun under Nicholas I faded. Years of political manoeuvring had helped diminish imperial independence, but the papacy discovered a recurring lesson. Weakening the emperor too much could backfire. A strong empire might threaten Rome's autonomy, but a weak empire often left Rome vulnerable to enemies who offered no grand ideal of order, only raw local power. The story opens on two frontiers at once. Germany is trying to become a more unified kingdom, and Italy is sliding into a crisis that drags the papacy down into local power struggles. In the north, Henry's rule reaches a turning point during a Hungarian attack. The raiders split into two columns. One group tried to push in through the west, aiming to break into Saxony by way of Thuringia. That force ran into coordinated resistance and was wiped out in the fighting. The other group drove forward more directly toward the king, moving to meet him near Merseburg on the Unstrut. Henry understood what frightened the Hungarians and what did not. Their style depended on speed, distance, and avoiding a heavy clash. They did not want to be pinned down by armoured riders. Henry used that fear. A screen of infantry moved out first, drawing the enemy in and tempting them to commit. When the Hungarians finally saw the heavier formations prepared behind the trap, they broke off and fled. The pursuit was long and exhausting, but the very speed that made the raiders dangerous also made them hard to punish. Henry's cavalry chased for miles and still caught few men. Even so, the result mattered far beyond the casualty count. The victory raised Henry's reputation sharply. The northern raids began to ease, and German leadership suddenly looked more credible to neighbouring rulers who wanted stability on their borders. Henry never carried the imperial crown, but the aura of an emperor began to gather around him in the eyes of admirers who saw order returning under his command. Not long after, Henry's health failed. Before his death, he tried to secure the future by turning succession into a public act. At Erfurt, he gathered leading men from the different German peoples and asked them to accept his son Otto as king. The assent came, but it was not unanimous in spirit. A younger brother believed he had a claim, arguing that he had been born while their father already held royal power, and that this changed the rules. The argument had no firm legal foundation, because Germany still lacked a settled hereditary system. Yet the very fact that such a claim was made shows something important. Ideas about legitimacy and dynastic right were starting to take root among elites who had once treated kingship as more negotiable. When Otto moved toward kingship, the ceremony chosen for his coronation was a message in itself. The location was Aachen, a place loaded with memory, tied to Charlemagne and the older Frankish world. Otto's father had relied on Saxon strength and then forced recognition from others. Otto wanted the reverse. A formal endorsement from all the major German groups, staged in a setting that linked the new ruler to the grandest traditions available. This was not only about style, it was about announcing what kind of kingdom Otto meant to build. The church took a leading role in the ritual. A senior archbishop presided, even as other great churchmen disputed precedence. Otto was presented not merely as a successful Saxon leader, but as a ruler chosen by God, named by his father, and acknowledged by the princes. The crowd answered with loud acclaim. Then came the symbolic heart of the ceremony. the handing over of royal insignia at the altar. The language attached to the sword, the cloak, and the staff framed Otto's power as both protective and moral. He was told to defend the Christian people, restrain enemies, preserve peace, and show disciplined care for those under his authority, especially the vulnerable. The goal was clear. Kingship was not being described as simple command. It was being framed as a sacred office with duties as well as rights. After worship, the ritual continued in a more political register. The dukes of the major regions served the king in traditional ceremonial roles. These were not random tasks, they were the old household offices of personal service, providing the ruler's quarters, overseeing the table, presenting the drink, managing the horses. Long ago, these had been menial jobs, but in a court they became honours precisely because they placed great men close to the ruler's person. In Otto's coronation, the great dukes performing these roles signalled submission and hierarchy. The meaning was unmistakable. The Saxon king was being staged as the superior lord of all the German lands, with the regional powers functioning as his servants and agents, rather than as semi-independent rulers. From the start, Otto's political idea differed from his father's. Under Henry, Germany could look like a coalition held together by personal authority and constant negotiation. Under Otto, the aim was to turn that coalition into a kingdom with a real centre, where duchies were not partners, but instruments. Otto did not seek to erase the regional structures, he sought to master them. The next years would test whether the duchies would accept that vision or resist it. Resistance came quickly and repeatedly. Family rivalries provided convenient banners for wider discontent. A half-brother with a contested status and a younger brother with wounded ambition became focal points around which dissatisfied nobles could gather. What followed was not a heroic civil war with clear sides and noble ideals. It was a long grind of rebellion, betrayal, threatened violence, and shifting alliances. The period is full of broken oaths and temporary reconciliations that collapsed as soon as circumstances changed. Yet through that chaos, Otto achieved something lasting. Over time, the duchies stopped looking like powers that existed on their own terms and began to look more like positions shaped by royal decision. Dukes, who once seemed rooted in local tradition, increasingly became figures who owed their authority to the king's favour. Otto only rarely tried to rule a duchy directly for long. More often, he preferred to place loyal men or relatives in key posts, turning the regional leadership into an extension of his own household and strategy. By the midpoint of his reign, the pattern was becoming visible. Bavaria ended up in the hands of Otto's brother after years of conflict, a sign that even bitter enemies could be absorbed into the royal system if they submitted. Swabia was linked to the royal family through Otto's own household and heirs. Lorraine was held by a major noble tied to the king through marriage. Saxony and Franconia lay under Otto's immediate influence. After years of tension, the duchies were concentrated within one ruling circle, creating the impression that German unity might finally be secured through a family network backed by royal power. While Germany was being pulled toward a stronger centre, Italy was moving in the opposite direction. At the end of the Carolingian era, the papacy had spoken as if it stood above all secular rule. It had claimed the right to judge kings, to define imperial legitimacy, and to decide political questions that affected the whole Christian world. It had also played an active role in Italy's defence and diplomacy. From a distance, it could look as if Rome was on the verge of becoming the supreme referee of European affairs. But the papacy's strength depended on more than legal arguments. It depended on the ability to remain universal rather than merely local. If Rome wanted to act as the head of Christendom, it needed broad support and a political partner capable of projecting order across Europe. In practice, that partner could only be the empire. Yet the papacy had pursued a strategy that weakened the imperial office by treating it as something to be controlled rather than reinforced. When imperial power collapsed into weakness, Rome lost the one external structure that could protect papal independence from local factions. The consequence was harsh. The papacy was drawn down into the city's internal struggles and became a prize in Roman politics. After an emperor was crowned in 896 by a forceful pope who favoured alliance with German power, the opposing Roman factions struck back. With his death, the city plunged into chaos. Popes rose and fell rapidly, often through violence. In the most notorious episode, a dead pope was exhumed, dragged into a church and subjected to a grotesque spectacle of judgment. The body was stripped of its honours and thrown into the river. The scene was not simply scandalous. It revealed how completely the papacy could be captured by local rage and rivalry when it lacked a stable external protector. A brief counter-movement followed. The disgraced pope's body was recovered and buried with ceremony, and a new pope tried to stabilise Rome by leaning on the Italian imperial claimants, who still existed in name, even if they lacked real strength. Rules were announced that aimed to bring imperial oversight back into papal elections. Not because emperors were strong, but because Roman factions were worse. For a moment, it looked as if Pope and Italian emperor together might impose order. That hope died quickly. The Italian claimant died by accident, and rivals rushed in. Northern Italian nobles and regional lords treated the royal title like a tool, inviting outside princes and shifting loyalties whenever it suited them. Another young ruler was brought in and crowned, but he proved unable to tame the turbulence. Popes continued to be made and unmade in rapid succession, and the records become a blur of upheaval. Out of that blur, one thing becomes clearer. Powerful Roman families were rising above the chaos and learning to control it. Wealthy houses near Rome began to dominate offices, patronage, and street-level power. The papacy, instead of standing above the city, was increasingly shaped by the city's strongest networks. In this environment, one pope stands out as unusually capable. John X acted less like a distant spiritual judge and more like a hard political operator. He tried once again to strengthen his position by crowning an Italian emperor and using imperial prestige as a lever against Roman factions. The partnership also enabled a rare moment of coordinated military action. Italy's princes were drawn into a joint campaign against a remaining Saracen stronghold in the south. Even the Eastern Empire contributed naval support. The campaign succeeded and improved security in central Italy. But victory had a price. Each time the papacy behaved like a regional Italian power, it gained practical influence and lost universal dignity. Leading coalitions, bargaining for troops, granting land, and directing warfare could protect Rome, but it also made the Pope look like one more prince among princes. The spiritual authority that came from being above faction was weakened when the papacy visibly depended on faction. At the same time, Roman society itself was being reshaped by a noble elite, whose titles echoed the ancient world but no longer carried its meaning. Words like consul, senator, and senate survived as labels, yet they described not a republican constitution but the dominance of a small aristocratic circle. Within that circle, influence could be held not only by armed men but also by women who controlled alliances, marriages, and patronage. One family in particular became the centre of gravity. Through marriage ties connecting Rome to the leading houses of Spoleto, Tuscany, and the Italian royal line, a formidable noblewoman, Marozia, rose to a position where she could shape the city's politics for years. Her husbands and allies supplied military power and territorial reach. Her household supplied continuity and strategy within Rome itself. As these local forces tightened their grip, the wider Italian kingdom drifted into weakness. The northern rulers who claimed the crown struggled to secure broad loyalty. Nobles, who could not settle their disputes, invited foreign intervention, repeating a pattern that would haunt Italy for centuries. One rival was murdered, another challenger took the field, and bargaining over titles continued as if the kingdom were a prize to be traded rather than a state to be governed. For a generation, even the imperial title effectively vanished from Italy's political reality. In its place stood shifting kings, imported claimants, regional lords, and Roman factions. A ruler from Provence eventually entered Italy under favourable conditions. Welcomed by a northern power broker and by a pope looking for help against Rome's internal enemies. Yet in the capital, the faction tied to Marozia had become so strong that it could imprison a pope, install rivals, and decide outcomes by force. John X, despite his talent and his successes, was overcome by that machinery. He died in 929, and his fall marked the grim logic of the age. Personal ability mattered, but control of Rome itself mattered more. In the long view, these decades explain why Otto's Germany and the papacy would later collide and cooperate so intensely. Germany was building a stronger centre. Rome was trapped in local struggles. The stage was being set for a new bargain, one that would eventually pull the German king into Italy, restore the imperial title in a new form, and reshape the relationship between crown and papacy for centuries. After the collapse of centralized Carolingian authority, the old empire fragmented into separate political units. Italy fell under the control of regional rulers. Burgundy formed its own power centre, and the western territories divided among competing kings. Aquitaine and Provence followed different leaders, each claiming legitimacy but exercising authority only within limited boundaries. The idea that the empire of Charlemagne could remain a unified structure disappeared. Although some of these rulers sought recognition from the German king Arnulf of Carinthia, their actions show that they did not truly regard him as their superior. Arnulf himself showed little desire to enforce universal authority. His primary concern was survival. The borders of his realm faced pressure from many directions, and the security of Germany required constant military effort. A decisive victory over northern raiders in the region of Lorraine demonstrated the effectiveness of coordinated German resistance and halted further attacks in that area. Yet another danger emerged on the eastern frontier, where a powerful Slavic state had risen. The Moravian realm expanded across Central Europe, bringing together numerous Slavic peoples under a single political structure. Its influence stretched across the frontier of Germany and represented something close to a united Slavic power. Although Christianized in its own manner and once loosely connected to the Frankish world, Moravia had taken advantage of internal divisions among the Franks to assert independence. Its ruler refused to recognize German authority, forcing Arnulf to respond with military campaigns. These expeditions devastated the land, but failed to secure decisive victory. Only the death of the Moravian ruler and the division of his territory prevented the state from becoming a dominant force in medieval Europe. Soon afterward, Moravian power declined rapidly and disappeared under the pressure of new invaders. The defence of the northeastern frontier rested largely in the hands of the Saxons. In the northern regions, this people had developed strong political institutions and military traditions. Since their conquest by Charlemagne, they had maintained internal cohesion and built a solid base of regional power. Their strength would later help reshape the political life of the German kingdom. Arnulf himself trusted their ability to defend the frontier and rarely interfered in their affairs. To the west, Arnulf adopted a different strategy. He placed his illegitimate son in charge of Lorraine, creating a semi-independent kingdom intended to act as a buffer between Eastern and Western powers. This decision did not strengthen unity. Instead, it added another division to the already fragmented political landscape. The new ruler proved ineffective and unpopular, and after Arnulf's death, the leaders of Lorraine rejected him and restored the region to German control. Once his borders were relatively secure, Arnulf turned toward the traditional dream of universal empire. The Pope invited him to Italy to receive the imperial crown, hoping for strong protection from a powerful northern ruler. An initial campaign achieved limited success, but resistance forced Arnulf to withdraw. Later, with stronger support among the German peoples, he launched another expedition. He reached Rome after overcoming fierce opposition, entered the city with military force and received the imperial crown. Yet success was brief. Illness struck him suddenly, and he returned north without securing lasting control. This marked the first attempt by a German king to dominate Italian politics, and for decades it would also be the last. In his final years, Arnulf continued defending his kingdom, but faced a new and terrifying threat. From the eastern plains came the Hungarians, a nomadic people who had moved gradually across the Eurasian steppes into Europe. Skilled horsemen and swift raiders, they resembled earlier invading peoples who had once shaken the Roman world. After settling in the lands of the Middle Danube, they began launching devastating raids across Europe. Hungarian armies swept through Italy, Bavaria, and the German territories, destroying armies and plundering settlements. Their mobility and unconventional tactics made them extremely difficult to defeat. Traditional methods of warfare proved ineffective against them, and the defensive system of the old Carolingian Empire had weakened significantly. Military responsibility had become concentrated in a narrow warrior class, leaving the wider population less prepared for collective defense. At Arnulf's death, his only legitimate heir was a young child named Ludwig. The German nobles nevertheless supported the boy as king, partly because his weakness allowed them to strengthen their own regional authority. During his reign, powerful regional duchies emerged as the true centres of political power. Bavaria, Swabia, Franconia, and Saxony each developed strong local leadership and distinct political identity. Bavaria, situated along the Danube, had long traditions of independence. Its warrior nobility defended the eastern frontier against invasions and developed strong internal unity. After suffering catastrophic defeat against Hungarian forces, the Bavarians rallied around local leadership and restored their own ducal authority, effectively re-establishing regional independence within the larger German kingdom. Swabia followed a similar path. Governed previously by royal officials, it developed a strong and ambitious nobility that resisted central authority. Rebellion and political conflict weakened royal control, and local leaders eventually dominated the region despite attempts to suppress them. Franconia, located in the central Rhine and Main valleys, contained the wealthiest cities and most influential bishoprics. Rival noble families struggled for control, and although one faction gained royal support, the result was not stronger monarchy but greater regional independence. In the north, Saxony presented a different development. The Saxons retained strong traditions of social structure and military organization. Although they had been converted to Christianity and incorporated into the Frankish world, their independence remained strong. Their leaders defended the frontier against Slavic neighbours and gained increasing political authority. Among their leading families emerged a powerful house whose influence would shape the future of Germany. When the young king, Ludwig, died without heirs, Germany faced a decisive moment. Rather than restoring the old Carolingian order under a foreign ruler, the German leaders chose their own king. Conrad of Franconia was elected by representatives of the major regions, marking an important step toward a distinct German political identity, independent of the broader Frankish tradition. Conrad attempted to strengthen royal authority by suppressing the power of the regional dukes, but his policies provoked resistance. Supported by church leaders who favoured strong central authority, he tried to impose royal control through force and harsh punishment. These efforts failed. Regional identity had grown too strong, and opposition only intensified. On his deathbed, Conrad recognised the limits of his policy and recommended that the crown pass to Henry of Saxony, a leader widely respected for his strength and influence. Henry accepted the kingship but rejected ceremonial coronation rituals associated with clerical authority, preferring support from the warrior nobility. His rule marked a turning point. Henry pursued a different strategy. Rather than crushing regional power, he recognised the authority of the duchies and bound them to the monarchy through cooperation and mutual interest. The German kingdom became a federation of powerful regions united under a single ruler, primarily for defence and stability. His greatest achievement lay in military reform. Facing constant threat from Slavic and Hungarian raiders, Henry reorganised the defence of Saxony. He strengthened fortifications, established protected settlements, and created a more effective fighting force drawn from the rural population. These measures prepared Germany for the next wave of invasion. In the early 10th century, Rome slipped into one of its strangest political moods. After a period when almost nothing is recorded beyond a pope's name, the city's power struggles returned in dramatic form. A strong local faction, tied to an ambitious noblewoman named Marozia, pushed her own son into the papal office. For Rome, this was not simply a church appointment. It was a move in a larger contest over who truly controlled the city. A new opportunity appeared when Marozia's second husband died. She was now free to form a fresh alliance, and one man was ready to take advantage of it. Hugo of Burgundy, already wearing the crown of Italy. Hugo's ambitions reached higher than the Italian throne. He wanted the grand title that still carried prestige, even when its substance had grown thin. Before attempting to secure that prize, he removed threats around him with ruthless efficiency, including a brutal act against a powerful relative in Tuscany. With obstacles cleared and his own position strengthened, he moved toward Rome. There was, however, a personal problem that could have blocked the marriage he wanted. It was solved without much hesitation, because the authority needed to approve exceptions was already sitting in the papal chair, held by a young man who owed his position to Marozia. The marriage went ahead, even though many Romans resented it. Hugo's behaviour across Italy had already made him enemies. Offices and lands were being handed to followers from outside the peninsula, and local elites saw their influence shrinking. That same mistrust shaped Hugo's conduct in Rome. He stayed inside the fortress of St. Angelo, where the wedding took place, as if he knew the streets beyond could turn hostile. The real turning point came from inside Marozia's own household. Her son Alberic, forced into humiliating service under his new stepfather, was publicly insulted by Hugo and responded with something Rome understood well. He turned personal outrage into political revolt. Alberic rallied the faction that presented itself as the defender of Roman independence and pushed the city into open rebellion against foreign dominance. The speed of the uprising suggests that anger had been building for a long time. Hugo was driven out before he could transform his Italian kingship into something larger. Marozia herself was swept aside by the momentum she had helped create. She was imprisoned by her son and disappears from public life. The Pope, John XI, was placed under tight supervision in the Lateran, controlled but treated with the formal respect his office demanded. For a moment, Rome appeared to reclaim something it liked to imagine about itself, that it could stand alone, governed by its own will, answerable to no outsider. It was a familiar Roman dream, returning like a tide. This time, it produced a surprisingly stable arrangement. Alberic became the recognized leader of the city's political life, and for more than 2 decades, Rome experienced an unusual stretch of internal order. The details of Alberic's administration are often unclear, but scattered evidence points to a real concentration of authority. Documents and coins show him acting not as a temporary strongman, but as the acknowledged head of the Roman community, described with titles that emphasized civic rule rather than subordination to emperors or kings. The idea behind this system was direct. The Roman population and its elites claimed the right to choose their own ruler, rejecting the notion that a king, an emperor, or even a pope should dictate Rome's political direction. Alberic invested heavily in the city's defense. The militia was reorganized, and Rome held firm against repeated attempts by Hugo to return. Alberic also leaned on a rising force that was changing religious life across Europe: monastic reform. A powerful reform movement associated with strict discipline and moral renewal was spreading from Burgundy into Italy. Alberic supported it not as an abstract spiritual project, but as a tool for restoring public order and encouraging a more serious religious culture in a society worn down by faction and corruption. Under Alberic, the papacy's position resembled something older than medieval kingship. It was protected and supervised without being crushed. John XI lived several years under this arrangement, and seems to have accepted the limits imposed on him. His successors, chosen under Alberic's influence, cooperated with the civic regime and carried out policies aligned with it. For much of this period, the papacy functioned less like a pan-European institution and more like the local bishopric of Rome, its wider voice muted by the political realities of the city. While Rome kept itself stable, Italy beyond its walls remained unsettled. Hugo of Burgundy was not a man to retreat quietly. He repeatedly tried to force his way back into Roman affairs and repeatedly failed. Elsewhere, he used intimidation, manipulation, and marriage alliances to bind Italy to his control. He married into influential houses, arranged strategic matches for relatives, and worked to block rivals before they could mature into threats. Yet every move created more resentment. The more aggressively Hugo pursued dominance, the more enemies he produced. Events in Burgundy complicated his ambitions even further. When the Burgundian throne became vulnerable after the death of its king, Hugo moved quickly, marrying into the ruling family and trying to secure the region for himself and his line. But the heir from the previous dynasty found support in the rising power north of the Alps, the German king Otto. That protection blocked Hugo's attempt to fold Burgundy into his sphere. In Italy, resistance finally took a decisive form. The Lombard elite, weary of Hugo's dominance, looked for a leader. Berengar of Ivrea, carrying his own dynastic claims and political skill, had previously taken refuge at Otto's court. When the time was right, he returned with armed backing and was welcomed by cities and nobles in the north. Hugo's position cracked. In desperation, he tried to preserve his family's hold by stepping aside in favour of his son Lothair, hoping the Italian public would accept a new face while the same power structure remained. Italy's elites did what they often did in times of uncertainty. They supported one ruler, then another, using rival claimants as tools to keep any single master from becoming too strong. The result was years of instability until Lothair suddenly died. leaving Berengar free to seize the crown and push his own son forward as co-ruler. At this point, Italy had a chance to stabilize under a strong local kingship, potentially in balance with Rome's civic regime. Instead, the pattern that had shaped the peninsula for generations repeated itself. The most influential forces turned again toward the north. Lothaire's widow Adelaide became the centre of the next crisis. Berengar tried to force her into a marriage that would legitimize his dynasty. When she resisted, she was imprisoned. She escaped and sent urgent appeals for help across the Alps. Rome's Pope, anxious about the safety of papal territories, also sought protection. Discontented nobles and churchmen in Lombardy joined in. A German intervention began to look not only possible, but necessary to many. Otto was now in a position to respond. Germany had grown stronger under his rule, and its resources could be moved beyond the mountains. Before Otto committed fully, his son Ludolf attempted an advance into Italy, likely hoping to secure a role for himself. The effort failed, and the ground had to be prepared by Otto personally. In 951, the German king crossed into Italy with ease and reached Pavia without serious resistance. Berengar avoided direct confrontation, and Otto did not chase him into the countryside. Instead, Otto acted like a ruler who expected recognition. He spent the winter in the old Lombard capital, issued grants, and behaved as a king already in command. Adelaide reached safety after a difficult flight, and Otto offered both protection and marriage. The wedding took place in Pavia, binding Otto to Italy through a powerful symbol. In theory, this alliance could have softened hostility among those still loyal to the previous dynasty. In practice, Italian politics rarely moved through loyalty alone. Power was built through force, bargaining, and reward. Otto understood this and used all three. With a crown in Italy and a new queen at his side, Otto's attention naturally turned toward the most prestigious prize, the Imperial title. But Rome's leadership did not want another master. The Pope, who had asked for Otto's help, refused to move toward an imperial coronation. The refusal likely reflected the civic policy Rome had followed under Alberic. Keep all outsiders from gaining a legal foothold that could be turned into domination. Otto chose not to gamble his German base for a title he could not yet secure. He withdrew to the north, prepared to wait. Back in Germany, Otto faced internal turmoil. Rivalries among powerful families and duchies erupted into rebellion, and the conflict was tied to the ambitions and grievances of Otto's own relatives. Chroniclers highlight dramatic betrayals, family quarrels, and shifting loyalties. But the deeper story was political. Otto was still building a royal structure strong enough to hold a diverse kingdom together. Meanwhile, another danger haunted the whole region: renewed Hungarian raids. These attacks swept across Bavaria and beyond, reaching deep into the west. Monasteries and towns suffered repeated plunder, and local rulers sometimes made cynical deals with the raiders against their own enemies. In 954, as Otto's kingdom was distracted by civil conflict, news spread that a massive Hungarian force was moving up the Danube again. The invaders pushed westward through vulnerable regions with little resistance. The threat helped force reconciliation among Otto's rivals. Negotiations through the winter ended with Otto reasserting control. He reorganized the duchies, weakening the power of unreliable relatives and placing strategic regions in hands he trusted. He also strengthened church leadership along the Rhine, ensuring that key ecclesiastical centers supported the crown. These measures were not only about domestic order, they were preparation for war. The next summer brought the decisive test. A vast Hungarian army crossed into German lands and began the siege of Augsburg. The city's defenders held out with desperate effort. Its bishop became the symbol of resistance, working to strengthen defences and rally morale. The besiegers, reluctant to assault strong walls, tried to force their own men forward, even driving them with whips. Then word spread through the Hungarian camp. Otto was coming. Otto had not marched with an overwhelming force at the start, but as he moved south, the contingents of most German regions joined him. For the first time, a truly united German army formed for a common mission. Yet the structure of that army revealed the truth of the age. Regional identity still mattered. Units were grouped by their homeland and leaders, and loyalty often ran first to duchy and only then to king. Near the Lech River, the Hungarians tried a familiar tactic. While Otto pressed toward a direct battle, a Hungarian detachment slipped around to strike the German rear, attacking baggage and a force assigned to protect it. The moment was dangerous. A collapse in the rear could have spread panic through the whole army. The crisis was met by decisive counterattack, led by a key commander, and the raiders were driven off. Otto then pressed forward with full force. The heavy charge of the Germans smashed into the Hungarian formations, and the battle turned into pursuit. The invaders were hunted down as they tried to escape, and their defeat echoed across Europe. It was not simply a battlefield victory. It signalled that the age of unchecked Hungarian raids was ending. In the years that followed, the Italian situation changed again. Rome's civic regime weakened after Alberic's death, and a new pope, young and politically inexperienced, found himself squeezed between Roman factions and external threats. Berengar, still active in Italy, pressed his advantage and alarmed many Italian leaders. The pope appealed to Otto, and the request matched Otto's long-term ambition. This time Otto was ready. Before heading south, Otto secured Germany's future by arranging his son's coronation as king, ensuring continuity of rule. Administrative responsibilities were assigned to trusted church leaders, and border regions were strengthened. With the kingdom stabilized, Otto crossed into Italy again in 961 and advanced into Lombardy. Negotiations began with Rome, shaped by mutual suspicion. Otto promised to respect papal rights, while remaining alert to Roman unpredictability. His arrival in Rome was outwardly warm, but his personal security measures revealed how fragile trust was. The imperial coronation followed quickly. After decades of dormancy, the imperial title was revived in a form that would shape medieval politics for centuries. Otto and Adelaide both received imperial status, and the relationship between empire and papacy re-entered European life. Almost immediately, the old question returned: who controlled whom? Otto presented himself as protector of the papal state, but he also demanded influence over papal elections and Roman governance. Agreements and decrees were issued that reinforced imperial involvement, justified by earlier precedents from the Carolingian past. Otto did not claim to reduce papal independence in theory, but in practice he insisted that Rome could not choose a pope and consecrate him without imperial oversight. The new order faced its first crisis as soon as Otto's attention shifted. While he was occupied with Berengar, reports reached him that the pope had returned to reckless behaviour and political intrigue, including contact with Otto's enemies. Otto marched back to Rome, no longer seeking a crown but acting as a judge. A council was summoned with Roman clergy and nobles as well as representatives from across Italy and the empire. Charges were presented against the Pope that painted a portrait of scandal and criminality. The Pope refused to submit to judgment and threatened excommunication. The council proceeded anyway and chose a new Pope. The selection was controversial because the chosen man was not originally a cleric, but the process was hurried through, creating a weakness that opponents would later exploit. Otto's intervention shattered his rivals. Berengar was captured and removed from Italian politics. Yet Rome remained unstable. Once Otto left the city, the deposed Pope's supporters regained confidence, expelled the imperial candidate, and restored their man. The restored Pope soon died suddenly in circumstances that fueled public rumour and moral storytelling. Rome then elected another Pope and demanded that Otto accept the choice. Otto refused. For him, the papacy's authority now rested on imperial force, and he was not willing to abandon his candidate. He returned, blockaded the city, and forced surrender. The new Roman Pope was deposed and exiled. The message was unmistakable. At this moment, the empire controlled Rome's highest office through military power. This revived empire invited comparison with Charlemagne's earlier creation, but the resemblance was limited. Charlemagne's authority had been supported by a broad Frankish realm and a stronger sense of unified military obligation. Otto's empire drew its real strength from Germany alone and operated in a world where local powers were becoming permanent and feudal relationships shaped every major decision. Charlemagne inherited and completed an older political tradition. Otto built his authority by constant struggle against entrenched regional identities. Charlemagne could often command obedience by reputation and structure. Otto relied repeatedly on force, negotiation, and the balancing of competing powers. The imperial title had returned, but it had returned in a different world. The final decade of Otto's long rule is remembered less for dramatic conquests than for the way imperial authority tightened its grip on Rome, and for how firmly the Saxon dynasty secured its place at the top of German politics. When Pope Leo VIII died in 965, the Romans did not try to dodge the emperor's role in papal affairs. Instead, they sent a message north, sounding out whether Otto might allow the return of Benedict, who had been forced into exile earlier. The problem resolved itself before it could ignite another confrontation. Benedict died at the crucial moment, removing the most awkward option and sparing both sides a fresh round of conflict. Rome then accepted the candidate the emperor preferred, a Roman churchman who carried respectability in a society that had seen far too many unworthy figures rise quickly. He was chosen and installed as John XIII. The pattern, however, did not change. A faction inside the city refused to accept an imperial pope, rose against him, and forced him out. John XIII fled to a new kind of protector, one whose influence was beginning to reshape central Italy. This was the Duchy of Capua, led by a Lombard prince named Pandulf. With his brother Landulf ruling in Benevento, Pandulf's family commanded much of the region between Rome and the southern coasts. Their position raised a larger question that mattered to every power on the peninsula. These Lombard princes were tied, at least formally, to the Eastern Empire, which still controlled parts of southern Italy and, at this moment, was ruled from Constantinople by an unusually energetic leadership. Would the Lombards remain anchored to the eastern sphere, or would they attach themselves to the rising force from the north, the Saxon emperor who now carried the imperial title in the west? Italy's politics were shifting, and the answer would decide who set the rules for the next generation. When Otto heard that Rome had expelled his pope, he moved quickly. It was his third crossing of the Alps, and the timing underlined the new reality. The emperor was no distant figure who could be ignored when the city turned violent. As Otto advanced, Pandulf escorted John XIII back toward Rome. Imperial control had rarely looked so visible. Otto entered the city and, alongside the restored pope, conducted a harsh reckoning. The rebels were tried and punished in ways meant to terrify as much as to correct. The message was blunt. Resistance to the imperial settlement would be met with iron. Pandulf benefited from this moment. In return for supporting the Pope, Otto rewarded him with significant territories, including strategic zones that strengthened his reach and signalled his new status as an imperial ally. Landulf aligned himself in the same direction. This shift made the conflict with Constantinople unavoidable. A contest that had been simmering over influence in southern Italy was now openly declared. Otto had already attempted diplomacy. He sent envoys east with a marriage proposal, a Byzantine princess for his son, Otto II. At the same time, the Eastern Court was preparing to protect its interests in Italy. A Greek army moved through the Balkans toward the peninsula, meant to coordinate with a fleet already operating in the region. The goal was clear: discipline the Lombard princes and secure the coastal cities that still leaned toward Constantinople. The Eastern Emperor at the time, Nicephorus, was not eager to pour resources into a long and dangerous expedition if a bargain could preserve what mattered most. A deal was floated. The military pressure would ease and the marriage would go forward. But the Western Emperor would have to abandon claims over Byzantine-held Italy. It was a diplomatic attempt to draw a boundary through the peninsula. Negotiations did not settle the issue. In 968, an embassy from Constantinople refused to concede key southern territories and resisted the marriage terms. Otto answered by moving with his Lombard allies into Apulia and placing Bari under siege, pushing directly against the eastern foothold. He also sent a sharp-tongued representative to Constantinople, the Bishop of Cremona, whose account later became famous for its bitterness and its vivid picture of courtly humiliation and cultural hostility. The mission achieved little. The campaign in the south also failed to produce a decisive breakthrough. Then events in Constantinople changed everything. Nicephorus was assassinated in 969, and the man who seized power afterward found it useful to calm tensions with the West. The marriage that diplomacy had struggled to secure was finally arranged. In 971, a Byzantine princess named Theophano was sent west, not the exact bride first demanded, but a woman of high standing linked to the new regime. The marriage gave Otto II a connection to the Eastern Court and provided Otto I with something he valued more than formal promises: leverage. After years away, the old emperor returned to Germany in 972. On the surface, the Italian years had yielded few obvious territorial prizes. Yet the deeper result was structural. The imperial position in Rome had been reinforced. Alliances in central Italy had been reshaped. The succession had been strengthened through a dynastic marriage that carried prestige and political utility. Otto had built a platform that his son could inherit, if the son proved capable enough to hold it. Otto the Great died in 973, in Saxony, at Memleben. His legacy was not simply a crown or a title. He provided the working foundations for what later generations called the Holy Roman Empire, in its German form. He had brought the German regions into a more durable unity, not by dissolving local identities, but by compelling them to cooperate under a ruler who could lead in war and impose order in peace. Yet he also tied this new empire to Italian ambitions. That southern focus would repeatedly drain German strength, create endless crises, and haunt the institution for centuries. When Otto II took power, internal politics followed a familiar rhythm. Regional loyalties, duchies, families, local traditions tested the centre as soon as a new reign began. The difference was that Otto I's hard work had made the royal idea stronger. Resistance still flared, but for a time it could be contained more effectively. Many conflicts mattered less for their drama than for their consequences. Borders redrawn, offices reassigned, and power redistributed in ways that slowly changed the map. The long-term trend under Otto II pushed toward fragmentation at the top level. Large, semi-independent blocks were broken into smaller units that depended more directly on the crown. Otto I had already begun this process in Saxony by granting a powerful role to Hermann Billung in the northeast and by entrusting border defense to loyal commanders. The frontier between the Elbe and the Oder, a home to partially subdued Slavic groups, became a laboratory for expansion, settlement, and military governance. A key moment came after the death of the great border leader Gero in 965. The massive frontier zone he had managed was divided into separate regions. One northern area would later become known as the core of Brandenburg, the seed from which a powerful eastern state would eventually grow. Another section became the Lusatian region, contested again and again by neighbouring powers. A third, centred around Meissen, evolved into the heartland of what later generations would recognise as Saxony in a narrower sense. These zones were entrusted to multiple military governors, creating a layered structure. Each local commander held authority. But the crown stood above them all, distributing power in a way that prevented any single frontier lord from becoming another Gero. Under Otto II, civil conflict became an excuse to apply the same logic elsewhere. Bavaria remained the most volatile centre, as it had been before. It was ruled by Henry, a man remembered for his constant quarrels and for his willingness to test the limits of royal patience. The reign began amid a chain of opportunities. When the Duchy of Swabia became vacant, the emperor chose not to let Bavaria's ruling family strengthen itself through marriage ties. Swabia was reassigned to a young relative connected to the imperial line, reopening the old rivalry between the two southern regions. At the same time, the emperor promoted a rising family in the eastern marches. A leading figure from this house received the frontier land along the Danube that would later form the nucleus of Austria. This was not just an honour, it was a strategic redistribution of military opportunity. Whoever controlled that frontier would command men, land, and war, resources that could either defend the kingdom or challenge it. Henry reacted as expected. He moved from resentment to conspiracy. When discovered, he was imprisoned, escaped, and raised open rebellion. Otto II answered with speed and force, recovering Bavaria and driving Henry into exile. But the emperor did not stop at restoring order. He reshaped the structure that had enabled Bavaria to become so powerful in the first place. Bavaria was handed to the imperial family through a loyal duke, but key border districts were cut away. Northern lands were reorganized and entrusted to the Eastern Frontier family. The Eastern March was confirmed as an independent military command. Southern border regions were pulled out and combined into a separate duchy centred on Carinthia. Church support was purchased in the usual medieval way, with grants of land and privileges that bound bishops to the imperial programme. Resistance did not vanish. Henry found allies and tried again, but the emperor's coalition, built on loyal relatives, regional rivals of Bavaria, and key church leaders, was too strong. By 978, at a major assembly, Henry was stripped of remaining influence, loyal dukes were confirmed in their territories, and Carinthia was placed under yet another Otto from the imperial family network. The balance of power in Germany tilted decisively toward the crown. The deeper significance of these border regions was not confined to German politics. They functioned as engines of expansion and as magnets for ambitious warriors. Frontier commanders could promise land, plunder, and status to men willing to fight. Over time, those eastern marches would shape the future of the region beyond Germany itself. The contests around Brandenburg and the Danube frontier were not side stories. They were early chapters in the making of Eastern Central Europe. For a long time, Many people assumed that medieval Europe lived under a single crushing expectation, that the year 1000 would bring a world-ending disaster. That idea used to explain almost everything historians noticed in the period. Why ascetic living spread, why the church gained such power over imagination, why learning advanced so slowly, and why so many people seemed to turn away from ordinary life. But closer study has softened that picture. Apocalyptic fears certainly existed, yet they were not the one master key that unlocked the whole century. What looks more convincing is something less dramatic but more constant. An ongoing Christian sense that the world could collapse at any time. A background tension that made fasting, renunciation, and fear of judgment feel natural. In that sense, the year 1000 works less as a literal countdown and more as a useful marker, a point where several long-running pressures can be seen converging, especially the growing collision between imperial power and the church. Those pressures were already visible during the early years of Otto III, whose reign began almost before he could speak. Otto II's frontier reforms, designed to strengthen the eastern borderlands, were tested immediately after Otto II's death. Otto III was only 3, yet the Saxon dynasty still had enough authority and habit behind it to keep the succession from collapsing. That did not stop Bavaria from trying. Henry of Bavaria, remembered as a relentless troublemaker, emerged from confinement, seized the child, proclaimed himself regent, and began acting as though the crown might be within reach. The Saxon leaders resisted quickly and decisively. The boy was transferred into the guardianship of his mother, Theophano, who proved herself not as a ceremonial figure, but as a capable political manager. Her regency was consumed by danger on the eastern frontier. Slavic groups who had been bound by tribute and pressure took advantage of the transition and rose in widespread rebellion. The new border system did not deliver an easy victory, but it prevented catastrophe. The defensive line did not permanently shatter, even though German influence in the region weakened for a generation and many areas slipped into practical independence. After Theophano's death, Otto III briefly lived under the careful supervision of the older Empress Adelaide and the Archbishop of Mainz, and then, still a teenager, began to rule on his own. Otto III matters less for battlefield triumphs than for an unusual mental world. His idea of empire was not simply inherited, it was imagined, studied, and performed. Charlemagne had built authority through a Frankish people and a warrior tradition. Otto I had revived the imperial title with a distinctly German foundation, relying on force, alliances, and control over church appointments. Otto III grew up differently, raised amid imperial symbolism, shaped by a Byzantine-educated mother, and trained in the best learning available. He began to picture himself not as a German king who wore an imperial title, but as the Roman emperor in a universal sense, the head of Christian order, tasked with restoring a grand, all-embracing authority. His education fed this vision. Unlike Charlemagne, who remained above all a soldier, and unlike Otto I, whose power rested on practical strength and personal command, Otto III absorbed stories of ancient Rome as models to imitate. He wanted an empire that looked like an empire, not a travelling court built around a battlefield tent. That dream collided with reality in the city that symbolized it most: Rome. After Otto I, conditions in the papal world had declined again. Corruption, violent factions, and crude local power struggles dragged the papacy into a reputational swamp. Northern churchmen increasingly spoke of Rome with open disgust. In France, leading voices protested the habit of appealing to Rome as if it were automatically a court of higher wisdom. They argued that Rome could not demand obedience while it offered scandal instead of example. A broader message emerged from this criticism: a growing belief that national churches had rights of their own and that papal authority depended, at least in part, on moral credibility. Amid this decay, Rome itself remained a battlefield between local clans. The Crescentian group tried to dominate the city, but without the disciplined administration that earlier strongmen had achieved. The papal office, instead of functioning as a steady centre of Western Christianity, became entangled in street-level politics and family power. That instability drew Otto south. The Pope at the time, John XV, was pushed out in factional fighting and appealed for help. He died before Otto arrived, but the vacuum created an opening. Roman envoys met Otto in northern Italy and asked him to name a new pope. It was a striking request because it treated the papacy as something that could be set in order by imperial decision. Otto responded by choosing his cousin, Bruno of Carinthia, a young man in his mid-20s. A northern German candidate was now placed on the throne of Peter, an event that signalled a changing principle. The papacy was no longer viewed as merely a Roman prize. If it truly claimed to represent the universal church, then, at least in imperial thinking, it could be filled by any suitable Christian. Bruno took the name Gregory V, a name heavy with historical resonance. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that emperor and pope, both young, related, and intensely committed to a shared ideal, might fuse their energies into a single program. Otto was crowned emperor. Crescentius and his circle were tried. Crescentius received a sentence of exile, softened at the Pope's request, and Otto returned north to handle frontier pressures. The pattern repeated with brutal speed. As soon as the emperor left, the Roman faction regained its footing, expelled the Pope, and reclaimed the city. Otto crossed the Alps again, restored Gregory, and ended the challenge with open force. Crescentius, cornered in a fortress, was captured and executed as a traitor. Rome had been resolved, but only by revealing how fragile Otto's arrangement was, without an emperor's army close by. Then, Gregory V died. Otto chose a second pope, this time not German, but perhaps even more significant. Gerber of Aurillac, the best-known scholar of his age, a man with rare technical learning and hard political experience. Gerber had risen from humble origins, educated in monastic settings, then pushed outward into elite circles by patrons who recognized his talent. He studied in the most advanced schools he could reach, including those connected to Christian Spain, and gained a reputation for mathematical knowledge so uncommon that it stirred the medieval suspicion reserved for people who seemed to know too much. Gerbert's career had already placed him at the centre of French power struggles. As a church leader, he was drawn into the conflict between declining Carolingian legitimacy and the emerging Capetian reality. He backed the side he believed represented the future, paid for it with exile and lost office, and in the process developed strong arguments against Rome's interference in local church affairs. His letters and public positions fed a larger European trend: the rising insistence that national churches had their own dignity and autonomy, and that papal authority was not a blank check to command everywhere without restraint. Yet Gerbert's story contains one of the period's great reversals. When he became Pope as Sylvester II, his earlier language about limiting Rome vanished. The new Pope defended papal supremacy with vigour. Otto III's universal imperial dream found its mirror image in an equally ambitious papal vision. Instead of promoting local independence, the Pope asserted centralized authority, as if the cure for Rome's degradation was not humility, but stronger control. This shift was helped by dramatic changes in the eastern lands. Otto's prestige rose when Christian expansion seemed to succeed beyond Germany's old frontier. On a journey eastward around 1000, Otto visited Poland and honoured the memory of a missionary bishop who had died violently while preaching among pagan groups near the Baltic. The Polish ruler Bolesław received Otto with lavish ceremony. Otto responded by granting symbolic honours and, more importantly, by supporting the elevation of a major Polish church centre into an archbishopric. That meant the Polish church could be organised under its own high authority, covering present and future conquests. Such a reordering required papal consent, because it affected the older claims of established German sees. The event showed how papacy and empire could cooperate when expansion and prestige aligned. Even more consequential was the transformation of Hungary. After the defeat of Hungarian raiding in the mid-10th century, the Magyar world began to change. Settlement grew, power consolidated under a ruling house, and Christianity advanced steadily. Missionaries came from both east and west, but Hungary's long-term choice tilted toward Rome rather than Constantinople. Around 1001, a Hungarian ruler, known after baptism as Stephen, sought recognition as king and asked Rome to sanction the organization of his kingdom's church. Rome welcomed this intensely. A crown was sent, and the new monarchy entered Western Christendom with formal ties to the papal centre. The Danube corridor, now safer under Christian rule, became a major route for travellers and pilgrims moving toward the holy places of the East. Those pilgrimages were themselves part of the age's moral climate. As ascetic ideals deepened, journeys to sacred sites became acts of penance and self-repair. More pilgrims meant more awareness of Jerusalem and the wider Eastern world. Long before the Crusades, the mental groundwork was being laid. The idea that Christian society might one day mobilize across borders for a religious cause. Even if no immediate campaign followed, the concept was taking shape. While Sylvester II strengthened papal claims, and while Christianity expanded eastward, Otto III pushed his imperial dream toward theatrical reality. He believed a true empire required a true capital, and only Rome could play that role. Earlier rulers had moved constantly, ruling from wherever they happened to be. Their courts were practical and rough. Authority was personal, direct, and close to the military life that sustained it. Otto III wanted something else: ceremony, distance, and grandeur. He built a palace in Rome, adopted the clothing and etiquette associated with Byzantine imperial culture, and surrounded himself with elaborate offices and titles. The language of bureaucracy and court ritual replaced older simplicity, even when the institutions behind those titles were thin or imaginary. A new administrative structure appeared in Rome, blending papal and imperial officials. In theory, the Pope governed the papal state, while the emperor protected it. In practice, the emperor's presence threatened to make the Pope look like a subordinate. Otto confirmed papal lands and privileges on paper, but the kind of empire he envisioned sat awkwardly beside any expanding doctrine of papal independence. The result was predictable. These were brilliant ideas built on symbols more than on power. For a moment, Roman crowds could be stirred by the romance of a restored world empire. But Rome's factions had their own instincts. As soon as Otto tried to make the dream operational, the city's political forces turned on him. The same energy that once welcomed him pushed him out. The emperor who imagined Rome as his throne found himself suddenly homeless, drifting, attempting to recover authority with too little force and too little patience. Back in Germany, suspicion grew. German princes and bishops watched a policy that seemed obsessed with Italy and inattentive to the needs of the realm. Internal opposition revived. The empire had limited strength. What it spent on distant theatre, it could not spend on holding order at home. Otto III, increasingly driven by intense religious feeling, withdrew to Ravenna and fell under the influence of a hermit famed for extreme discipline. Instead of acting like his grandfather, either returning north to secure loyalty or marching decisively to retake Rome, he lost time in fasting and self-punishment. When he moved again toward Rome, his army was inadequate. Italian disease struck him down. In the winter of 1002, not yet 23, Otto III died. Sylvester II lived only about a year longer. With the death of both men, their grand design, an empire remade as a universal Roman order, paired with a pope who ruled the church with renewed central authority, collapsed. Later, emperors would keep the title and continue the struggle. But the specific millennial fantasy of Otto III's circle died with him. His death also reopened a practical question. Who would rule Germany? Marriage negotiations with Constantinople were underway when he died, but he left no adult heir. The direct Saxon line ended, and the princes had to choose a successor through election. For the first time, the process resembled a true contest among rival candidates rather than a simple transfer within a dominant house. One figure could claim a faint dynastic connection. Henry of Bavaria descended from the earlier Saxon rulers through family lines. But inheritance alone did not decide matters. Henry's real strength came from being the leading man of Bavaria. His opponents, such as powerful lords in Swabia and in the eastern marches, presented themselves as proven commanders and regional anchors. One rival was killed early in the struggle, removing a dangerous competitor. Henry secured the crown the way many medieval rulers would afterward, through calculated promises, especially to the church, whose support could tip assemblies and legitimize outcomes. The imperial story moved on, not with the clean logic of hereditary right, but with bargaining, alliances, and the hard arithmetic of power. In the early 11th century, the election of a German king still looked nothing like a fixed constitutional procedure. There was no clear rulebook, no defined voter list, and no single assembly whose decision automatically ended the contest. Power had to be gathered piece by piece, and legitimacy had to be built in public by persuading the right people at the right time. When Henry of Bavaria pushed his claim in 1002, the first priority was not a grand vote, but a crown on the head and a churchman willing to place it there. The Archbishop of Mainz mattered because he could turn a claim into a coronation. Henry secured that support first, then negotiated separately with leading figures in Saxony, Thuringia, and Lorraine, until a more formal ceremony could be staged at Aachen. Only after that did a rival like Hermann of Swabia accept defeat and recognize the new ruler. That recognition, more than any tidy ballot, was what election meant in practice. Some backers were always more valuable than others, but exactly who counted most was decided anew each time, shaped by local crises, alliances, and the balance of fear. Henry II inherited many of the same headaches his predecessors had faced. Restless borderlands, ambitious regional powers, and the constant need to keep Germany from sliding into fragments. Yet his reign is especially revealing for another reason. It sits near the opening of a long, defining struggle between imperial authority and papal reform. Later, writers gave Henry a harsh nickname, painting him as a ruler dominated by clergy and churchmen. The label stuck because his personal piety was real, and because he cared intensely about religious institutions. But reducing him to a caricature misses what made his reign politically important. He lived in an age where religious passion was everywhere, sometimes turning into fanaticism, and he had the practical intelligence to channel that energy into state building. In other words, devotion did not prevent him from pursuing power. It offered him tools. By this point, a hard lesson had become obvious. Germany's greatest bishoprics were not just spiritual centres, they were political engines. They controlled land, wealth, courts, armed followings, and networks of influence. Any ruler who held those offices firmly could steer national policy. Any ruler who lost their support would find it almost impossible to compensate with purely secular resources. Henry's central approach was therefore both simple and dangerous. Stay close to the episcopate, keep it loyal, and use it to strengthen the monarchy, while never forgetting that a strong episcopate could someday push back. This matters because, in the broader conflict that was beginning to form, three demands were rising in the reforming church. First came the drive to end clerical marriage across the ranks, not only for bishops and abbots, but for ordinary parish priests. Second came the insistence that church offices should be filled without bribery or private purchase, a campaign against the buying and selling of sacred positions. Third came the most explosive claim of all, that a bishop's authority should not be granted by any lay ruler, but should flow from the Pope and the Church alone. These ideas would become the battle lines of the next century. The last demand, especially, struck at the heart of the traditional royal role in church government. Henry II, however, continued to act as rulers, had acted for generations. He claimed the right to appoint bishops in Germany and Italy, and he used it without hesitation whenever a vacancy appeared. That practice did not feel radical at the time. It felt normal, almost inherited, stretching back through imperial tradition. Henry filled major sees with men he believed would support his program. Sometimes those men disappointed him. But the point is not whether every appointment worked out. The point is that Henry assumed the crown could shape the church's leadership. There was a catch. By making the German episcopate stronger and more organized, the monarchy was also forging a potential weapon against itself. A powerful archbishop could decide that the church in Germany should follow its own priorities, not the king's. This danger appeared clearly with an ambitious Archbishop of Mainz, a figure with no taste for being anyone's second. His reform idea leaned in a different direction. Strengthen the German church as a coherent body, with Mainz at its head. In pursuit of that, he gathered bishops in a council at Seligenstadt and pushed decisions that effectively limited direct appeals to Rome. The message was unmistakable. Church discipline should be handled at home, not exported south to be overturned by distant authority. Such measures were not necessarily a declaration of independence from Rome, but they were a sharp protest against unlimited Roman interference. Rome did not welcome that kind of resistance, and it did not fit the emperor's own vision of reform either. Henry was already cooperating closely with a vigorous pope, Benedict VIII, whose plans pointed toward a different model, a strengthened papacy working with moral reform movements to impose discipline on a chaotic society. When Rome moved against the Archbishop of Mainz, the response in Germany was revealing. The Archbishop summoned a broader gathering at Höchst, and the German bishops closed ranks. Rather than leaving one man isolated, they declared that if the Archbishop had offended, the German episcopate as a whole stood behind him and asked Rome to reconsider. That stance shows how far German church leaders had already come in seeing themselves as a unified force. The moment was unresolved because both Pope and Emperor died soon after, leaving no clear final outcome. But the pattern was visible. A national church body learning its strength and a papacy determined not to let that strength set limits on Rome. These German assemblies were not only about resisting Rome, they also pursued reform on local terms. Monasteries, in particular, became a target for Henry's heavy hand. He treated many great religious houses as institutions that should serve public order and spiritual seriousness. while also recognizing that their wealth could support royal power. In some places, he replaced communities he considered lax with stricter monks. Elsewhere, he reshaped or absorbed foundations to bring them under tighter supervision. The result was a reform program with two faces: moral discipline outwardly, and political control beneath it. Even when the spiritual intention was genuine, the crown did not forget the advantage. Meanwhile, another current of reform, the one associated with Cluny, was spreading across Europe with growing influence. At first, German reform did not depend on that movement, but the streams soon met. One reason lay in Burgundy, the region where Cluny's authority was strongest. Burgundy's monarchy was fragile. Kings carried the title, but real power sat with energetic nobles who resisted strong central rule. When the Burgundian king Rudolf III, childless and politically weak, flirted with the idea of making Henry II his heir, it revealed the direction of the wind. Burgundy was beginning to look east toward Germany rather than west toward France. The proposal sparked resistance among Burgundian nobles who feared that such a succession would not be a personal inheritance, but a step toward incorporation into the German political system. Henry attempted to assert authority with expeditions, but these moves produced more friction than results in his lifetime. Even so, the negotiations mattered. Control over Burgundian routes into Italy was strategically priceless. Those passes were among the keys that made continued imperial involvement in Italy possible. At the same time, the papacy itself was shifting. After a long period of disorder, it returned to the influence of a powerful Roman family circle that had produced dominant figures before. Out of that environment came Benedict VIII, a pope who, unlike many around him, aimed at order and administrative competence. He pursued two practical methods: restraining Roman factions and harnessing the ascetic reform energy spreading through Europe as a tool for moral discipline. That second method was crucial. In a society prone to violence and corruption, spiritual reform was not merely a private matter, it could be a political instrument. Benedict's policy also marked a break from earlier Roman strongmen. He sought support not only inside the city, but from the empire. Henry II entered Italy amid papal rivalry and declared he would judge church disputes according to established tradition. He chose to back Benedict and, in return, received the imperial crown. A temporary alignment was formed: emperor, pope, and the ascetic reform movement, pointing in the same direction. If such a coalition could have lasted long enough, it might have reshaped Europe quickly. The real question was whether it could survive the pressures it created. That coalition showed its character in a major council at Pavia in 1018. The reformers aimed at a region notorious for clerical family life. In Lombardy, priests living openly with wives were not rare, and local custom often treated their children as socially recognized, sometimes even granting them advantages linked to church property. The council's decrees attacked the practice directly. Clergy were ordered to abandon wives or face removal from office. Children of such unions were stripped of special protections and could be bound to church service in harsh ways. The council also addressed the buying of church offices and signalled that reform would continue under broader authority. Germany followed with its own enforcement soon afterward at Goslar. Here the emperor's hand appears clearly. Measures were passed that punished relationships tied to clerical marriage, with public humiliation, exile, and severe legal penalties. Officials who tried to declare such children free could lose office, and notaries who helped them secure property faced brutal punishment. No one should imagine that decrees instantly changed entrenched habits. The struggle would last for generations. Yet these actions mattered because they clarified the agenda. By the end of Henry II's reign, the main issues of the coming conflict were sharply outlined: clerical celibacy as a programme, anti-corruption in appointments, and the larger question of who had the right to invest bishops with authority. But every push creates resistance. Even as papacy and monarchy cooperated with ascetic reformers, opposition was growing in ways that few fully recognized. The national instinct, still weak in kingship and often absent in princes, began to appear more clearly inside national churches. German synods that limited appeals to Rome were one sign. France also produced critics who feared outside monastic influence, shaping policy that, in their view, should belong to responsible royal power. Even efforts aimed at peace, like church-sponsored restraints on violence, could be attacked as the work of idealistic monks interfering where a strong king ought to act. The theory was reasonable. The problem was that kings often lacked the strength to do the job. In practice, the ascetic reform movement was one of the few forces pushing society toward discipline and order when royal machinery could not. Henry's reign was also dominated by relentless warfare and border crises. He fought on multiple fronts: Northern Slavic pressures, the emergence of a more organized Polish power, friction along the Adriatic where Greek interests still mattered, and early Norman expansion in Italy. Those pressures limited how far reform could go, because the emperor was repeatedly pulled away to deal with immediate threats. Even so, he largely maintained the upper hand. When he died in 1024, the empire looked stronger and more stable than it had for some time. By then, the imperial idea had settled into Europe's political landscape. That did not mean the emperor truly directed the continent. It did mean the empire had a recognized prestige, and other powers were willing to treat it as an arbiter in moments of need. In Italy, Henry's policy counted as a success in one key sense. He resisted yet another attempt to revive an independent Italian kingship. This time, around a Lombard claimant who attracted support from those who hoped to gain by opposing imperial authority. That movement lacked deep unity and failed to become a true national force. It flickered as an opportunistic coalition rather than a durable project, and then faded. Italy, for the moment, remained tied to the larger imperial system, an outcome that would shape European politics long after Henry II was gone. When Emperor Henry II died in 1024, the shock travelled fast beyond Germany's borders. For years, the empire had looked larger than life, not because its institutions were universally rooted, but because a capable ruler kept them standing. The moment that ruler vanished, the cracks showed. On the eastern edge, Poland's powerful Duke, Boleslav, moved quickly to claim a royal title, signalling that he no longer intended to behave like a subordinate in anyone's order. In northern Italy, Lombard nobles revived an old dream, a king of their own. They sounded out the French court, and when that offer was rejected, they turned to another great magnate, hoping to import a royal name that might legitimize resistance to German influence. In Pavia, the ancient Lombard capital and a symbolic centre of Italian independence, anger spilled into the streets. The imperial fortress, a visible reminder of outside authority, was torn down in an act of public defiance. Along the western frontier, the situation looked even more dangerous. In Lorraine, two dukes explored whether loyalty might be transferred to the King of France if the bargain seemed better. Nearby, a formidable French prince watched Burgundy like a prize. Burgundy had been promised, at least in theory, to German rulers. But promises were one thing, and control was another. For a lord with ambition and soldiers, Burgundy was too valuable to surrender simply because a distant emperor claimed a future right. For a moment, it seemed that Henry II's achievements were about to evaporate. Yet the empire did not collapse. Instead, It emerged from this crisis not weaker, but, in some respects, more durable. That outcome was not an accident. It reflected the long struggle waged since Otto I to break the habit of regional defiance inside Germany itself. Those earlier decades of internal conflict had forced German elites to learn a hard lesson. If the centre fell apart, everyone would pay the price. The danger beyond Germany's borders made that lesson impossible to ignore. Henry II left no child and no obvious heir from his own line who could claim the throne on family grounds. That vacuum created something rare, a genuine opening for a broad decision rather than a rushed takeover. Earlier, elections had often followed a familiar pattern. A strong candidate secured one or two major power blocks, then pressured the rest into acceptance. In 1024, the process took a step towards something more deliberate. A large gathering assembled between Mainz and Worms, near the Rhine. Leaders came from across the realm, representing the major regional communities. There was still no tidy system of representation, no formal ballots in the modern sense. The old idea remained. The men who bore arms and held authority had a right to speak on the public future. But the atmosphere was changing. The emphasis was no longer on which region should dominate, or which clan could claim precedence. The argument turned toward competence, stability, and the common interest. Two leading candidates stood out, both named Conrad, both from the same broad Frankish aristocratic circle, and related to each other. Opinion was split. The moment could have turned into a feud, the kind of rivalry that had so often invited civil conflict. Instead, something revealing happened. The elder Conrad approached his younger cousin directly and pressed the case for unity. The empire, he argued, could not afford a split at the top while enemies tested every border. The two men agreed that the result of the choice would be enforced together. Whoever won would be backed by the other. It was a bargain designed to prevent the usual aftermath of a contested succession: rebellion, private war, and opportunistic alliances with foreign powers. The selection fell on the elder Conrad, later known as Conrad II. In temperament, he was closer to the early warrior kings than to the more refined rulers of the late Saxon line. He was not celebrated for scholarship. His strength lay in practicality, an instinct for what mattered, and a readiness to act before enemies could coordinate. That kind of ruler was exactly what the moment demanded. The empire's problems were already taking shape in distinct directions. In the east, Poland remained the immediate concern. Boleslav died soon after Conrad's accession, but his successor refused to lower the banner. He adopted royal styling and prepared to defend independence with force. To make that stance credible, he looked for partners who could squeeze Germany from another angle. A northern alliance with the ruler who controlled Denmark and England threatened to create pressure along both the Baltic and the frontier zones further inland. Conrad responded with speed and calculation. Rather than waiting for a hostile coalition to harden, he negotiated directly with the northern king. A territorial concession secured something more valuable: a stable ally who shared religious and political interests, and who wanted recognition among Europe's leading Christian rulers. The result was not merely peace, but a strategic rebalancing. When Conrad later moved against Poland, the northern flank did not collapse at the worst possible time. The west was more volatile still. Lorraine, stretched across key river valleys and crossroads, had always been a hinge between German and French influence. Two dukes held it, and both resented the outcome of the election. They withdrew from the assembly, and their discontent quickly drew in others. Now, the stakes went beyond personal loyalty. If rulers in Lorraine believed France offered better terms than Germany, feudal custom gave them room to consider switching sides. A French king showed interest. A powerful duke from Champagne offered support, expecting help in return for his ambitions in Burgundy. A younger Conrad, the elected king's own cousin, broke earlier promises and joined the League. Even the king's stepson, a celebrated knight with a following eager for rewards, stood ready to gamble on rebellion. Conrad II dismantled this threat with a single decisive move. Instead of chasing rumours or negotiating with every conspirator, he struck at the coalition's centre. He marched into Lower Lorraine and offered its duke a clear, tempting bargain. Loyalty now would be repaid later with greater authority. If he stood by the German crown, he would eventually hold both parts of Lorraine. The offer worked. The duke's defection left the conspiracy without a focal point. One by one, the other players backed away and sent in their submission. Lorraine stayed within the empire's orbit, and years later the promised consolidation was carried out. It was diplomacy delivered with the credibility of an army behind it. With the eastern and western fronts steadied, Conrad turned toward Italy and the imperial crown. This time, the journey was not sparked by desperate invitations from Italian factions. It was driven by a claim Conrad believed belonged to the German king by tradition: the right to be crowned emperor. Italy, however, looked unstable. The Lombard nobility remained suspicious of German supremacy. An Aquitanian duke had briefly entertained the idea of an Italian kingship for his son, then backed away after seeing the reality on the ground. But the hostility in the north did not disappear with that withdrawal. Conrad's approach was familiar in method, but careful in execution. He understood that holding Italy depended on finding reliable partners inside the peninsula. The Lombard clergy, led by powerful churchmen in Milan, were beginning to cultivate an independence that would later make them useful allies of the empire in its coming struggle with reforming papal authority. By anchoring himself to this clerical network, Conrad gained a secure base. Then he spent time doing what successful medieval rulers usually had to do, enforcing claims with force where persuasion failed. He remained in northern Italy for roughly a year, breaking resistance and stabilizing his position before marching toward Rome. In Rome, the papacy was led by a man whose rise revealed how worldly the office could become. A previous pope from the same dominant Roman family had pursued reform with energy and seriousness. After his death, the family's priority was not reform but control. They promoted a layman closely tied to the machinery of administration. In a single day, he was pushed through the necessary clerical stages, and the city accepted him without major resistance. It was an open reminder that local power networks still treated the papacy as a prize. Yet in foreign affairs, this pope saw the value of alliance with Germany. He formally invited Conrad to Rome and crowned him at Easter in 1027 with striking ceremonial splendor. The event drew other rulers into the scene. The King of Burgundy and the king who ruled across Denmark and England were present, along with a vast array of nobles and clergy from Germany, Italy, and Burgundy. Rome's street politics also played their usual role. Scuffles between locals and foreigners erupted as they so often did, expressing a deep resentment of outside intervention. Resentment that coexisted, paradoxically, with repeated calls for outside force whenever Rome's internal factions spiraled out of control. A major synod followed the coronation, but it did not deliver a sweeping purification of church life. The age's most dramatic religious reforms were not decided in one meeting. Conrad's most consequential achievement lay elsewhere: Burgundy. The idea of bringing Burgundy under imperial control had been building for decades. It began as a dynastic arrangement, agreements between kings, more than a popular movement within Burgundy itself. Under feudal logic, such deals were easy to propose. the strategic benefits for the empire were enormous. Burgundy offered alpine routes into Italy that could reduce dependence on eastern passes. It also provided a buffer against France, much as Lorraine did further north. Its wealth and population promised new resources for a crown that often struggled to fund its ambitions. For Burgundian nobles, the prospect was far less attractive. A stronger overlord meant law, oversight, and limits, exactly what many local lords feared. They preferred weak kings they could manipulate to a powerful foreign ruler backed by German armies. When Burgundy's king died, a French magnate with a plausible claim marched in, hoping to seize the kingdom. In the Romance-speaking areas, he found some welcome. In the Germanic districts, including parts of what is now Switzerland, sympathy leaned more toward the empire. Conrad answered with a blend of diplomacy and pressure. France's king had recently died, and his successor depended heavily on powerful vassals. He could not casually strengthen one of them by allowing an unchecked Burgundian conquest. Conrad offered friendship and a marriage alliance involving his young daughter and the French heir. That proposal reduced the chance of a united French front. Then, Conrad turned military pressure toward the challenger's home region rather than getting stuck in a long Burgundian campaign. With his own base threatened, the claimant hurried to negotiate and abandoned his Burgundian ambitions. The way was cleared, and Burgundy was incorporated into the empire in 1032. For roughly 2 centuries after, Burgundy's political fate became intertwined with German imperial politics. Administrative machinery adapted. Burgundian affairs were handled through their own institutional channels, much as Italy's had long required special management. The empire's expansion also tightened its relationship with the reforming monastic world, centred at Cluny, since Burgundy was one of Cluny's heartlands, and a corridor through which its influence could spread. Conrad himself was not a devotional reformer in the style of Henry II. His interest in church affairs was primarily political. He appointed bishops confidently, asserted royal authority, and preferred church leaders who would not challenge the crown with excessive claims. He also adjusted the distribution of high offices within the empire, shifting key administrative roles away from rival centres toward more dependable hands. Much of his reign, however, was consumed by a deeper project, making kingship in his family more secure. The problem was structural. Feudal society was steadily turning fiefs into inherited possessions, fixing regional powers in place. Meanwhile, the king, in theory the head of the system, could still be chosen and replaced. Conrad looked for a counterweight. He promoted policies that strengthened hereditary rights among nobles on the condition that these rights were extended downward to their own vassals. This could reduce private wars, sparked by contested inheritances, and could bind a broader class of fighting men to the crown. It also offered lower vassals at least the hope that royal justice might protect them from abusive lords. But this policy had a second edge. By normalizing hereditary security for powerful families, it also helped those families become more entrenched. Conrad attempted to balance that risk by building his own family's position through facts on the ground. When opportunities appeared, he took direct control of major duchies and arranged for them to pass into the hands of his son. Over time, he secured Bavaria and Swabia for Henry, and placed Carinthia under a loyal ally who, lacking heirs, would ultimately serve the dynasty's interests. Saxony and Lorraine remained outside this family consolidation, held by strong local powers. Conrad's vision was clear: hereditary stability for the crown and inherited rights for the nobles, but without allowing the great regional identities to regain their older independence. The pattern was familiar in medieval politics. A policy offered as a road to order could also lay new foundations for future conflict. By strengthening the principle of inheritance across society, While trying to make the monarchy itself more dynastic, Conrad helped create a more stable empire in the short term. Yet he also deepened the long-term tension between a central authority and the increasingly permanent power of regional lords, an instability that later rulers would inherit along with the crown. Northern Italy at the start of the 11th century did not only struggle with foreign power and shifting crowns. It also simmered with a harsh social rivalry inside its own warrior class. The tension between powerful lords and lesser nobles had existed for generations. But in Lombardy, it carried a special intensity. Here, the fight was not only over land and honour, it was about who had legal security, who could pass a holding on to a son, and who could be pushed aside at a lord's convenience. At the centre of the storm stood Milan's archbishop, Aribo, a churchman whose position was far more than spiritual. Milan was a political engine, and Aribo behaved like a prince. Earlier, he had supported Conrad II's entry into Italy, and had helped place the imperial programme on a firm footing. But success encouraged ambition. Aribo pressed the rights of his church over much of Lombardy with a confidence that offended a large and growing group of smaller nobles. These lesser vassals, often the men who fought most frequently and endured the most risk, felt trapped between the authority of bishops and the arrogance of the richest lay lords. Lombard society had its own vocabulary for this hierarchy. The great vassals and leading families formed an upper layer that could dominate courts, influence appointments, and shape local policy. Beneath them stood the lower military class, men with obligations and arms, but fewer protections. Aribo, determined to enforce Milan's claims, leaned on the upper stratum as his instrument. That alliance was effective in the short run, but it deepened the resentment below. Meanwhile, across the Alps in Germany, Conrad II had been building support by giving the lower fighting class more reliable rights and more direct access to royal justice. In Lombardy, the same kind of men reached their breaking point. The result was a wave of resistance. Across northern Italy, lesser vassals pushed back against the pressures that had been normal for decades. They demanded stability, inheritance, and courts that did not simply reflect a lord's mood. Their struggle quickly gained political meaning. An emperor who wanted allies in Italy could hardly ignore a mass of armed men offering loyalty in exchange for protection. Conrad did not hesitate. About 10 years after his first Italian campaign, he crossed the Alps again, not merely as a claimant to ceremonial titles, but as a ruler ready to reshape the balance of power. He summoned Aribo to answer before an imperial tribunal. It was a startling escalation. An archbishop, the most influential churchman of Lombardy, treated as a subject who could be judged and removed. Conrad declared him deposed, and then moved beyond symbolic punishment. He openly supported the lesser vassals in their disputes against powerful overlords. The emperor's decision was not sentimental. It was calculated. Backing the lower military class weakened the network of regional magnates who could turn Italy into a hostile battlefield. It also mirrored Conrad's broader strategy in Germany, where he sought loyalty from men who were tired of insecurity. This policy was expressed in a famous set of rules that soon circulated as a guiding statement on feudal rights. Its basic message was clear. The smaller vassal would not be treated as disposable property. Holdings were to be inheritable. A lesser noble's land in fee could not be stripped away on a whim. Legal disputes were to be heard in a court of peers rather than in a rigged forum controlled by an enemy. Appeals to the emperor were recognized, giving men outside the top layer a path to justice beyond local intimidation. The rules also aimed to prevent a quiet trick that could hollow out a warrior's status, converting a landholding obligation into a mere cash tenancy, which might make administration easier for a lord, but could reduce the vassal to something closer to a renter than a partner in arms. The impact appeared almost immediately, because the political temperature in Italy was already high. Aribo, cornered and humiliated, did not accept defeat as a private matter. He tried to wrap his cause in a broader banner. The idea that Lombardy should throw off German direction and revive a more independent political identity. He sought partners beyond Italy, reaching for an alliance that could strike the empire in multiple places at once. The plan that took shape was bold. An external prince would be offered the Italian crown. Pressure would be applied in Lorraine, and Italy itself would become the trap that seized the emperor. Burgundy and Italy, in this vision, would fall together like linked prizes. For a moment, it looked dangerous. The foreign prince did begin to move, but the empire's defensive web held. Loyalty in Lorraine, especially from a key duke, helped smash the western part of the scheme. The would-be invader was defeated and killed, and the Italian conspiracy lost its muscle. Conrad's approach, controversial as it was, had worked as intended. By tying the lesser warriors to imperial authority, he strengthened his position while isolating the local elite, who hoped to make Italy ungovernable. In Rome, Conrad's presence triggered a different kind of movement. The city's population had its own grievances, not identical to Lombardy's, but rooted in the same desire for protection against inherited burdens. A notable act from this period was the confirmation that Romans should be judged under Roman law in their legal disputes. This was more than a technical point. It signalled an effort to relieve Roman inhabitants from legal pressures that had accumulated under earlier rulers and outside administrations. Law here was a tool of identity and a shield against exploitation. By reaffirming this legal tradition, Conrad was not proclaiming a grand philosophical program. He was responding to local demands in a way that strengthened order and indirectly reinforced the administrative apparatus around the papacy. Yet Conrad's dealings with the papacy at this time also show how limited his moral agenda really was. The Roman Church was in a deeply compromised state. A powerful local faction treated the papal office less as a sacred trust and more as a possession to be controlled. After an already disappointing pontificate, the same family network pushed an even more shocking candidate forward, reportedly a child. The contemporary moral outrage is easy to understand, but Conrad did not react like a crusading reformer. He confirmed the arrangement and moved on. His actions suggest a ruler focused on stability and leverage, not on cleansing Rome's inner life. If his legislation in the city served anyone, it served administration, not conscience. The priority was to keep the machinery functioning and to keep Rome aligned with imperial policy. Conrad's sudden death soon after these Italian measures cut off whatever longer plan he may have had for a more tightly centralized empire. Even so, his succession arrangements held. His son Henry, already crowned as king in Germany, faced no serious organized challenge at the moment of transition. Some chroniclers even claimed that expectations for the new ruler were so high that the father's passing produced little public mourning. Whether that judgment was fair or not, it reveals the mood. Conrad was respected as effective, but Henry was anticipated as something different. The contrast between father and son mattered. Conrad had been a hard political operator, a soldier of practical instincts. Henry III had grown up within a stronger culture of learning, shaped by clergy and by courts, where education carried prestige. His mother, connected to the more polished traditions of southwestern Europe, ensured that his training was not purely martial. In an age when serious learning flowed through church institutions, a prince educated at this level could hardly avoid absorbing a sense of how vast the church's influence had become. That background did not necessarily make Henry submissive to clerical power. It did make him attentive to it, and it prepared the stage for a reign in which the relationship between throne and altar would become the defining drama. By the time Henry took power, the empire's reach looked unusually wide. Conrad's diplomacy and campaigns had produced tangible results. In the east, Poland's large state was weakening, showing the familiar problem of unstable unity. In its shadow, Bohemia, now Christian and politically ambitious, leaned toward Germany for support. Hungary was divided between pagan reaction and Christian alignment, and the Christian side looked naturally to the strongest neighbouring force. In the north, Denmark's earlier expansion stalled after the death of its great ruler, and that shift reduced the risk of a heavy alliance pressing Germany from the Baltic and beyond. In the west, France's monarchy struggled against powerful vassals and lacked the strength for major foreign adventures. In the south, northern Italy's armed classes were, for the moment, tied to the imperial order more securely than before. And in Rome, the papacy was so entangled in local faction that it could not operate as an independent great power on the European chessboard. Inside the empire, the position of the crown looked strong as well. The new king controlled key duchies directly, and in several regions there was little appetite for revolt. Only a few areas remained as consistent centres of local identity that could resist central direction. It was a remarkably favourable opening, comparable to the best starts of earlier strong rulers. The first priority was obvious: secure the eastern frontier before turning back to the west and south. For centuries, the eastern border had faced scattered raids, but now the shape of the threat had changed. Larger Slavic groupings had formed, and Christianity, though influential, had not always created deep stability. Earlier missionary structures had produced outward conversions that could be reversed when political order collapsed. Bohemia's duke, ambitious and energetic, understood that religion could be used as a national rallying point. He sought to elevate Prague not only as a capital but as a spiritual centre with its own authority. Such a move threatened older ecclesiastical prerogatives linked to Germany's most powerful church leadership, and it also suggested a political shift. A Bohemia seeking direct recognition from Rome might become less dependent on German kings. In this environment, the early reign of Henry III became a test of where Europe was heading. The empire stood at a moment when its outward influence was broad, its internal structure unusually firm, and its rivals divided. At the same time, the Church's reforming currents were growing louder. In one direction stood rulers who treated the Church as an administrative partner and a political instrument. In another direction stood voices demanding that the Church cleanse itself of corruption, free itself from worldly bargaining, and claim a higher independence. Henry's education and his alliances would pull him into that moral movement more strongly than his father had ever been. The outlines of a larger confrontation were emerging, not as a single event, but as a slow shift in expectations about what kings should do, what bishops should be, and who had the final word in the Christian world. By the mid-11th century, the papacy had reached a level of disorder that shocked even a public long accustomed to Roman faction fights. After the death of a strong pope, control over the office slid into the hands of a single local clan that treated the highest seat of the Western Church as if it were a private asset. The choice of one successor made the problem plain. A man who had been a lay administrator one day could be hurried through the clerical ladder the next, simply so power would remain inside the same family circle. That decision was not just controversial, it announced openly that the papacy was being handled as a political prize. When that pontificate ended, the same approach continued, but with an even darker twist. This time, the family pushed forward a child. The fact that such a plan could be carried through tells its own story about the state of Rome. It also says something about the empire's priorities, because the German ruler of the period showed no urgent impulse to intervene. For years, the broader Christian world complained, but the pressure that might have forced a change did not arrive. At first, the scandal might have remained a scandal of appearances only, if the young pope had been guided by restraint. The deeper issue was always there. The papacy had become a place where spiritual claims and hard political power were fused together, and in a city like Rome, that fusion could easily rot into corruption. In this case, the rot spread fast. Rumours multiplied, and the behaviour attributed to the boy pope crossed a line that Romans were not prepared to accept, even with all their tolerance for elite excess. When it was said that he intended to marry and establish a wife in the Lateran, the city erupted. A rebellion forced him out, and in the vacuum another claimant was pushed into office, backed by money and alliances that did not pretend to be pure. For a brief time, the second claimant held on. Then, the old faction struck back with force and restored its boy pope. Yet even after returning, he seems to have realized that power in Rome had turned poisonous. A third solution appeared, promoted by a different group that wanted stability and a better public face. Their candidate was a respected Roman cleric, known for learning and personal seriousness. But the price of that solution was a bargain that revealed how far the papacy had fallen. The office was effectively purchased. The strange irony is that many reformers greeted this buyer as a saviour. It was not because they celebrated corruption. It was because they believed the only way to remove a public disgrace was to pay it out of the city and replace it with someone who could restore discipline. In that circle stood figures tied to the emerging reform movement, and among them was a young churchman who would later become the central strategist of the entire struggle between papacy and empire. The crisis in Rome was now so extreme that it began to resemble an older pattern from the age of the first Saxon emperors. A papacy trapped by local warfare, and a German monarchy with the strength to intervene. The language of the empire made such intervention feel less like opportunism and more like obligation. A ruler who claimed to lead Christian order could not ignore a spectacle where three men, each backed by different factions, asserted rights to the same office. Accounts from the time describe clerics in Rome protesting the disgrace and calling for outside help. Even without those appeals, the logic of imperial politics pointed in the same direction. The question was no longer whether a German king would come, but what kind of church program he would support once he arrived. The young ruler who marched south had been shaped by a different environment than some of his predecessors. His education and his alliances inclined him towards strict reformers who demanded moral discipline in the clergy and an end to buying offices. Yet he was also a king of Germany, raised within a political system where bishops were pillars of royal government. He could admire reform without surrendering control. That tension would become the heartbeat of the coming century. In late 1046, the king entered Italy with little resistance. At Pavia, a church assembly met in his presence, and the talk almost certainly returned to the disease that was poisoning church life: simony, the buying and selling of sacred positions and influence. But the decisive confrontation came at the edge of the papal territories. There, a council was summoned, and the three rivals were ordered to answer. One claimant arrived and was dealt with first. He was condemned and removed from office, reduced to a monastic life. Another claimant, the man who had acquired the papacy through money, stood before the council and admitted the charge. He argued that the purpose had been good, that the purchase had been meant to rescue the church from disgrace. The council did not accept that logic as an excuse. A dramatic resignation followed, carried out in public as a signal that the office itself needed cleansing. The third claimant did not appear. He had returned to Rome and tried again to hold power by force. That refusal mattered, because it forced the king's party to move forward without him. A second assembly in Rome declared him removed as well. In a short span, the three competing claims were dismantled, and the crisis was contained without a civil war inside the city. The procedure was important. It was presented as a lawful correction, not a naked conquest. Yet the reality was just as important. Without the presence of the king, it is hard to see how Rome could have untangled the problem at all. Then came the most delicate decision of all. Who would lead the papacy next? And where would that person come from? Rome's recent record had destroyed confidence in the city's ability to supply a credible pope from within its own factions. The answer followed the direction taken earlier under strong emperors. Candidates would be sought beyond the Alps. Stories circulated that the king first offered the office to an ambitious church leader in the north who refused it. The choice then fell on a German bishop. The new pope's first major act was political and ceremonial. He crowned the king and queen as emperor and empress. Another gesture followed that carried long-term consequences. The emperor received an honor in the city that the imperial side interpreted as confirming the right to shape papal elections. In the moment, it looked like an orderly settlement that restored dignity to Rome. Later, it would be remembered very differently by those who wanted the papacy to stand free from imperial control. From this point on, the struggle becomes harder to reconstruct cleanly, because later, writers fought about it as fiercely as the politicians did. The closer the story gets to the great clash between church and state, the less neutral the surviving accounts become. Every side rewrites motives, every document is debated, even the language of decrees can be surrounded by suspicion. That fog doesn't erase the main outline, though. As long as this emperor lived, the balance of power allowed him to keep papal appointments largely in his hands. Over roughly a decade, a sequence of popes came from the German world. Some ruled only briefly. One ruled long enough to define the age. The pattern is one of history's most striking ironies. Men elevated with imperial support stepped into Rome, touched the weight of papal tradition, and began to act less like imperial administrators and more like independent guardians of a universal church. The power that seemed to owe its position to the emperor started to develop the instincts that would later challenge imperial supremacy. The clearest example is the Pope who emerged as the face of reform, a noble from the borderlands, connected by blood to imperial circles and known for strict clerical ideals. When the emperor offered him the papacy, he hesitated. He accepted only after insisting that Rome itself confirm the choice through public consent. That condition mattered. It was a way of reducing the appearance that the Pope was simply an imperial appointee. It also suggests that this Pope understood the danger of being seen as a creation of the throne. On his journey to Rome, he visited the great reform monastery of the age, and from the beginning of his reign he surrounded himself with men committed to moral renewal. Among them was a monk whose political talent would soon reshape Europe. His arrival in Rome was designed for the public eye. Instead of entering like a triumphant official, he entered like a pilgrim, humble in appearance, signalling that the papacy belonged to the wider Christian world rather than to a single faction or a single king. The city responded warmly. For a moment, the tension between Roman pride and foreign intervention eased. Once installed, the new pope acted as if the office carried a roaming responsibility. The papacy, in this vision, was not a court that waited for complaints. It was an engine that moved through Christendom, correcting abuses. He targeted the most corrosive practice of the age, the buying of church offices and the transformation of clerical life into a marketplace. This was not an abstract moral complaint. In many regions, bishops and abbots controlled wealth, land, courts, and armed followings. If those positions were bought, every level below them could become a cascade of bribery. Reformers believed society itself would decay if the Church did not recover authority and credibility. The Pope's first great demonstration took place across the Alps. He announced a major council in France and made clear that he intended to discipline corruption and enforce standards. The French Church was not enthusiastic. For generations it had operated with wide independence, and it had little interest in a pope arriving as supervisor and judge. Even the King of France hesitated and attempted to obstruct the plan before stepping back. When the council met, the turnout from the highest ranks was weak. Monastic leaders, however, appeared in greater numbers, revealing the fracture between reform-minded religious houses and many secular bishops who feared outside control. The Pope proceeded anyway. He treated absence as defiance. He summoned non-attending bishops to explain themselves, and when they did not respond, he used the harshest spiritual penalties available. He also turned the council into a public reckoning. Leading churchmen were questioned about how they gained office, and notorious offenders fled rather than stand inquiry. Entire regions were warned and ordered to answer in Rome. The Pope did not yet press every reform demand to its limit. Some issues, like enforcing celibacy among parish clergy and redefining who had the right to invest bishops with office, were not pursued with full force at this moment. But the central message was unmistakable. The Pope claimed the right to supervise the whole Western Church and to treat powerful local traditions as secondary. What made this intervention so effective was not universal obedience, but the lack of coordinated resistance. Local leaders might resist quietly, delay, or maneuver for loopholes, but they did not have a unified mechanism to block papal action. In some places, papal authority was accepted almost by default. In one striking case, a bishop was appointed directly by papal decision with little sign of a major pushback. The French realm, divided by feudal rivalries, could not easily mobilize against an outsider who spoke in the language of moral reform. From France, the Pope moved into Germany. There, the reception was far stronger, in part because the Emperor gave public support, and because German bishops were more closely integrated into royal governance. The Pope's approach was also more diplomatic, less confrontational in tone, emphasizing shared principles and focusing disciplinary action on clear moral failures rather than on sweeping challenges to local privileges. Still, the underlying risk had become visible. A pope empowered by reform ideals could one day treat imperial influence as a problem, rather than a foundation. The emperor had restored the papacy's standing, but he had also helped raise a force that might outgrow its leash. Back in Rome, another major council reinforced the direction of policy. The papacy now stood openly at the head of the reform movement. The next step, not yet fully realized, would be to remove dependence on the empire and to claim freedom of action in elections, discipline, and appointments. The Pope's energy was relentless. He travelled constantly, held assemblies, issued judgments, and cultivated a popular image that resonated far beyond elite politics. Stories spread through Italy and the South that portrayed him almost as a saintly figure, and those legends are less important as facts than as evidence. They show a growing bond between the papacy and mass religious sentiment. This was a turning point. The papacy's natural opponents were beginning to look like kings and worldly church princes who benefited from the old compromises. Its natural allies were becoming reform monasteries, devout networks, and increasingly the urban populations that were starting to discover their own political strength. In that shift lies a clue to centuries of European conflict. The papacy would not rely only on treaties and crowns. It would learn to draw power from movements, from moral language, and from the ability to mobilize support against entrenched elites.